I've had something recently happen to me that I'd be curious what you two think. It has to do with deception, it has to do with relationships. I'm not going to name names because because it might be too personal
Sure.
for a recording. But let me put it this way. So recently, I heard a story about somebody that I know getting involved with a girl that already is in a relationship. Okay. Now, we all know from the get-go, this is just like a bad idea. Like, this is just like a bad idea. Now, here's the problem that I start having is when certain people that I know that they also know, uh, and I'm gonna throw in the therapist in here too, uh, will say that the girl is emotionally cheating. Okay. Now, I have a couple problems with this. The reason why I have a couple problems with this is no one's asked what the girl's perception of the situation is. All I have heard is what my, I'll say, my sibling thinks and feels about what is happening. But no one has any consensus or any elucidation on what this girl actually thinks or feels. Now, I have a problem with this because the labeling of emotional cheating is a charge, is a moral charge. And it elucidates a couple of problems for me because one, it goes, so how far have we gone that therapy is now is an ethical language, right? It's an ethical language, and people can now use it against each other. I mean, you see it all over Instagram. Like, here's the definition of the narcissist. You might be with a narcissist, right? It's ethically charged. The person watches the video, they go, "Yep, that fits that. Yep, that fits that. Oh my god, I'm with a I'm with a narcissist." And the conversation I had was mind blowing because I want to like throw my face into the wall because what my sibling told me was like, well, isn't that the definition of emotional cheating? So isn't that what confirms emotional cheating? The definition? I'm like, oh, the definition confirms emotional cheating. Okay. Well, there's problems with that because no one's asked the girl if what she's doing is emotional. I was like, so even if by definition is perceived that way, no two parties have concluded to an agreement about what constitutes emotional cheating. Now, of course, what makes this all messy is that that girl's in a relationship. So I don't know exactly what those two partners have an agreement with and what they haven't talked about. Now, if they just so happen to have looser definitions of intimacy and friendship, I have a hard time finding these people morally to blame. But what I do know can be morally to blame is if we don't ask these people what their perceptions are. Um, but I can say at least two facts about the situation. The girl's in a relationship and she only wants friendship, and it seems like my sibling is ignoring that. So for me, there's room for moral culpability here. But again, I'm curious of what you guys think because the last question that was raised was what if she is emotionally cheating? What if she is doing it? And I think, well, I feel like that's not entirely relevant because God knows what the agreements are within that relationship. Well, all I know is what's happening between the individual that I know and what's happening between this girl, which apparently I don't know anything about because all they can express to me are very key words. What I feel like she makes me feel and what I think that she's thinking.
Hmm.
So I'll be there.
No, I actually think this is an extremely important topic because it speaks to a very large thing, actually.
And I'm glad Seth is here because I actually think this is extremely relevant to his work because one of the key principles is for me facing the person. But we live in a world where you brought it up that people can't even order food without being overwhelmed with anxiety, right? You put those two together, we're pretty screwed because most situations, I'll even say most problems, just grant me that language, the likelihood of the problem being addressed is proportional to the amount of parts brought in. The more parts, the more compound the principle is, the more unlikely that there will be an address. You want to stick to as simple as a principle as possible. And this you can even look like as just kind of a, just kind of a rubric of problem solving, if you just grant me that, is the more complicated, the more compound the situation becomes, the less likely it will be addressed because it becomes complexity. Basically, the way to look at it is a three-body problem. Once you get three, you're screwed, right? And it's very, very difficult not to get three in any more situation unless it's just you facing the person, you talking to the person. Once you ask this person or bring in other people, you've got a three-body problem and you can't compute anymore and everything becomes very, very hazy. The Bible is really clear. It says if you got a problem with your brother, you go tell the brother, you go talk to them. Then it even gives an order, like with the church, if it involves churches. First, you go to them directly. Then if they clearly won't listen, then you go to the priest. Then, after that, you may go to the deacons. And then you go to the congregation. But there's this very clear order that has to be followed. But it's not adding any more pieces until absolutely necessary. But there's something in us that wants to do the absolute opposite. When something arises, we want to make a coalition. We want to go to everyone else but that person to tell them how we feel. And naturally, in all probability, if you give someone your side of the story, they're going to go, okay. Like they're going to agree with you. Now, no one likes confrontation in general. And also too, most of the time when you give your side of a story to someone, they have no idea what you're going to bring up. You just said, I need to talk. What people do is they say, I need to talk to you. And then and then you're in it, right? And now you feel like you've been moved into an alliance. I think this is how most people's relational problems go, actually. And then it becomes a giant mess. And then you get into definitions, right? Like, well, if the definition is X. I think wherever Mr. Jockin is right now, and we just had a talk on his class on health, basically, this is where we are if we can't think beauty, because basically we can only think definition, not principle and capacity. Like you say, well, what's the definition? You say this, you say, well, then it is this. But if is it good or bad? That's what you're asking. Well, beauty would say, well, does it sign for beauty or not? Right? Is beauty being inhibited by this activity? Right? Or not? That's a different question. You'd have to face the person, be around the person, interact with the person. But we don't want to do that. And because it's really, really hard and requires a lot of courage. And then I'm just thinking about Seth's work so much because if you can't breathe as you interact, your nervous system goes crazy when you're confronting them. It is an incredibly difficult thing to face someone or to tell people, this is what I've been told. What is your perspective? I want to hear what you're saying. To be able to hold that, working on your nervous system, working on your body, being able to hold it. Those are all the skills. But since we have a society that don't have those skills, and in fact, we can't even order food at a register anymore, because we're so overwhelmed by social anxiety, then we go, this is actually what ends up happening. People go for affirmation. And this is where actually affirmation is dangerous. There's a lot of talk about needing affirmation, how affirmation is important. I think relationship is important. I'm not sure about affirmation. It is clear that children die without relationship, without attention. Like, let's say that. It's clear attention matters. But it depends on what you mean by affirmation. Affirmation can simply be coalition building, right? And that actually can be something where you're avoiding the anxiety of confronting the person with affirmation, which is kind of the opposite of anxiety, right? And affirmation can be a way to feel like you've done the work that needs to be done, when really it is the energy of avoidance, because you can actually get an energy in avoiding a problem. Because, you know, like if you know you're supposed to do something and you're not, you can suddenly be really productive in other areas or whatever. Like you can actually get an energy in avoidance, but it's very tempting. And that energy, though, tends to also get directed in the spreading of the story or getting more people involved. And so then you get this real spiraling problem because the energy is directed toward worsening the problem rather than addressing the problem, right? But that would require assess work. And you know what I'll say and then pass it for any responses to anyone. I am strongly of the opinion that basically if you ask the moment you get into a this person said, you know, this kind of who said what, you're basically not making progress. You know, basically the only thing, like there's a way in which ethics and asking questions about what is the right, you really should only ask, have I faced them or not? Have I confronted them? And that being the simplest of all possible principles that you can hold to. And then after that, see what occurs. But that should be primary. Now, there are, of course, are gray zones where the person is so enclosed in themselves, so unwilling to listen that talking with them won't do anything. Well, you need to try to see that's the case. Like you need to, that must be earned though. Like, and not just once, continually for like a while, multiple times, not just do it once, like they won't listen. Okay, you did it. It's got to be more than one day for 20 minutes. It's got to be like over weeks. And you and really too, if it's truly the case that someone is that enclosed, that's when you're dealing with a deep, arguably psychological trauma or something else. Which then, if it's that, it's usually not even about the thing that has caused the problem. Like there's a deeper thing that has to be addressed, and actually, whatever is on the surface now is not. Is almost secondary to whatever that deeper thing is. Often you'll see that if it truly is like they're truly closed off and won't even listen, then there's like a deep fundamental something in their entire life that not always, but that can be the case. I do also think categories like emotional cheating, you get into some interesting questions there. What is the difference? Can a wife have a friend? Why is that not at what point does friendship become emotional cheating? Does it have to be sexual? Like is it specifically the emotion of lust that is cheating? Or is it an emotion of enjoyment of being around the person? Well, that's very dangerous because I would hope your spouse has enjoyment around people other than you, right? And if you go, well, they're of the opposite sex, and that's where people get nervous. But that's also where it's like, well, be more beautiful then. You know, you need to work on being more beautiful to attract them in, right? There is wisdom in going, I'm married and in a relationship, and it is not wise to be alone in a room with this person. There's something to be said about wisdom and discernment, and especially to do it if currently with your husband or partner or et cetera, so you're upset with them. Like for me, instead of talking about emotional cheating, I would almost want to say, is this wise? You know, are you being wise right now? Now that, you know, it's easy to like, they're not being wise, okay? But calling it cheating, to me, that's the kind of, I guess, and I'm saying a lot, so I'll stop. But to me, those kind of terms are what people throw on when they don't have philosophy because they can't think things like wisdom or discernment. Like if we don't have a culture of wisdom and discernment, then we're just going to use basically accusations because I don't know how to persuade you or to talk with you. So to move you to my side, all I have is accusations. Like without philosophy, all there is force. So the funny thing is often I found emotional cheating is actually a force of emotional manipulation, where that accusation is possibly manipulating the person to your perspective of the side, right? Now, of course, it could be true that there actually are quote unquote emotionally cheating, but then the question would be, what are the details of that phrases, and how could you know that if you haven't confronted them and asked for their opinion? Like if you haven't done that, you're not working with anything, right? You may be able from your position say, it seems to me what the person is doing is unwise. And because it seems unwise, I would like to speak with them to know what is their view of it. And but the language, I greatly do prefer the language of unwise because it really matters how you frame a situation that you're going into. If I frame it to you and I say, hey, Sarah, I think you're emotionally cheating right now. Oh, well, screw you. You've already like that's not the best frame to enter a conversation. You go, Sarah, I've seen that you're doing this, but I know you're in a relationship and it just doesn't seem very wise to me. And I'm concerned about it, but I want to hear your perspective and if you're okay with it. You hear how unwise, it's still not easy, but it's a space we can enter that probably is more likely to be productive. It really matters how we frame things. But one of the reasons we like framings like emotional manipulation is because it's easier to get an affirmation of other people to our side. Like it's such a charged term that it's easier to engage in coalition building, right? And to me, it's also not I have not personally found people use it in a useful way because a phrase like that would require basically a philosophy paper to say, what do we mean? What particular emotion leads to emotional cheating? Like in what way, right? And to actually do that kind of work one by one, like Socrates being like, what do we mean by justice? This, like going down. Usually that's not what is occurring. It's usually where it seems to people that someone is getting close with someone else. And that feels dangerous or wrong, right? Well, then then perhaps it's an issue of wisdom, and it's not discerning to do those things. But I find that frame more useful. But I will indeed, and I'll stop. The simplest principle is have you faced them? Have you spoken to them? But we have an age of people that can't hold anxiety in their bodies. And if they can't hold anxiety in their bodies, they can't do that stuff. So they're going to end up in 3 body problems. And this is where Seth's work is important. So thank you for doing it, Seth. But I'll pause there. I'll be curious, anything on anything and anyone.
I'll chime in on that. And there's ways that other things I was thinking about could connect to this. But what's funny is when Javier, when you started to tell that story, I think one of the first thoughts was, oh, wait, am I being asked to weigh in on the morality of this? And I quickly said, okay, no, that's not what Javier is doing. But then my next thought was, well, that's what I guess your sibling was asking you to do. It's like, hey, Javier, can you please be the judge and jury? Or can you please, whatever label you would give it. But, and I think Daniel's already spoken to this, but it's really amazing to me the more I think about, having started with the frame of embodiment and then later through circling and other practices, really looking at what unfolds in a conversation. This could be a sort of a strong word, but to come to someone and say, hey, I'm involved in this situation of, there's vague notions here, there's disagreement, there's some question of morality, and would you help me to determine whether I'm right or wrong? Or are you going to judge me the way the other person in the story I'm telling? Like you are drawn in almost a kind of a violent way. Like there's a certain affront to, and like, I think at the same time, like, so if I'm thinking of bigger picture things like what Danny was referring to, what's written about in Belonging Again, at the same time as I hear this story, it's like, oh yeah, I know that situation. It almost feels like this is something we ought to just be prepared for. Like unreasonable requests will be made. And, and we could sit here, and sort of get curious together and have this extended meditation on what happens. But in the moment, Javier just, like, someone asked him a question, now they're looking at him, waiting for him to say something. So you just, that's where it becomes very somatic. Like you can feel, oh, this doesn't feel right to me before you actually have time to like list all the ways. You just know based on how you show up in the world that when someone confronts you with something, there's this feeling of, wait, why are you doing this to me? Oh, okay, but now I have to say something. And but then if we go to the language of it, like I appreciated what you just modeled there, Daniel, with like, you know, with Sarah, like you're concerned that she might be doing something unwise. But what I heard you do there is you tried to say, okay, here's the sort of blunt, forceful way of doing. But the next thing you said, I don't remember your words, but it seemed like your beginning was to foreground, this is the nature of my relationship with you. And because I feel X, Y, and Z about you, therefore, I would like to bring up this topic and I would like to discuss this with you. Like it's, and there's a way that could be cumbersome, actually, but it feels like that's kind of the predicament we're in now. Because, you know, before you even get to ethical cheating or something, like how many different viewpoints are there on ethical cheating? Is it even a thing? I mean, I could have a, I could decide for myself what my opinion was on that, and I could go back and forth, and I could check out, you know, various imaginary case scenarios, and I could get pretty clear with myself. This is how I feel on the topic. But even then, the next person is not going to have the same starting point, and then so am I even willing to do the emotional work? And do I have the patience? And as you said, Daniel, do I have the somatic, you know, the somatic patience to be there to go through the discussion? And I mean, as I heard the story, that's not what the request was to you, Javier. It was just like, I want an easy answer. Can you come in on my side or something like that? So yeah, I'll just make one gesture at the broader thing here, but it's just that, you know, on the one hand, with the sort of cancel culture and stuff, there's this thing that happens, which I have experienced directly, where you can be committing a crime because you have the wrong expression on your face while someone's talking. You know, like you're like, huh? Because you're really confused, and then they're like, oh, is that a microaggression? Right? Like we can go to that place. However, at the same time, I think the sensitivity that's being named there when someone gets mad about the expression on someone's face is the fact of the matter is, if I do start looking at you like you're talking crazy, you do feel that, you know? So just, you know, our tone of voice, all the things that I refer to when I talk about musicality and language, but very much the words as well. I think as you were saying, Daniel, I think that morality versus, I think you used the phrase, Javier, like the therapeutic, like that's an easy place for us to flip frameworks without noticing it. Like I'm talking about, is this wise or not? And the other person is talking about, well, you know, given my background and, you know, the way I was raised, can you expect me to be able to handle this or not? And I mean, so sometimes the wisest thing is to say, my nervous system is not up to the task. And like you said, Daniel, it's time to get out of this room. It's time to be elsewhere. But I do think in this day and age, without policing each other, part of we're really being called to do, like if we are trying to, like I was just listening to your conversations with C Money on the whole, you know, map is indestructible, and like, am I stuck inside of my own viewpoint? And does your new viewpoint just appear to me as like static or stress or anxiety? Or can I feel that anxiety but go, oh my gosh, this might be a way out of my enclosed world to find out something new? You know, like one of the things I'm noticing in my own personal life is just like, hey, Seth, can you get out of the house more often? Like you can connect, you know, you can go on the net and talk to people, but like I journal every morning. Sometimes I make myself go to a cafe and journal just so I won't be in my kitchen, right? And there's this sort of a discomfort there, be maybe more comfortable in my kitchen. But it seems to me like if we're going to find ourselves in situations like the one Javier describes, and we're going to skillfully move through it, we actually have to begin to notice what is the impact of my communication moment by moment on the other. And of course, I have to be in some level of projection to do that. But I have to kind of ask myself, like, I'm clear on what I'm saying, but is what I'm saying like too much to ask the person I'm talking with right now? And like, how do I do this dance? And sometimes it's just the best thing we can do is to understand how much lack of understanding is likely to still be here at the end of the conversation, and not think we're going to just eradicate it, but just be okay with like, okay, maybe we can resonate on some level. Anyway, yeah, I'll leave it there, but I think this is a fascinating place of inquiry.
Absolutely. I'll just say one thing.
Because otherwise I'll get into complexity science, which this actually relates to for me. But I'll resist and give it to Javier. For me, on that idea of, yeah, there is a certain cumbersome in saying, this seems unwise to me, but I know that is my perspective. I would like to hear yours. One of actually the advantages in a way of a statement like that is its cumbersomeness, because that feels like there's space for you to enter. But if I say, it looks to me like you're emotionally cheating, it's almost too slick. It's too clean, actually, for the person to be like, well, what can I say then? So there's a way in which actually one of the problems with phrases like emotional cheating and labels in general is their cleanness. Because they have a certain bamness, where the gauntlet is dropped and the person is taken aback and they're already kind of maybe anxious there. So to enter into a space to actually share with you where they're coming from is more difficult. So, but it's very
for a moment. It's like saying, I know who you are. Yes. You are this. And that's what I was saying. Like, that's a kind of a violence. That's a kind of like, oh, you just pinned me to the wall and put that marker over my head. So yeah, that's where we have to be really careful, because all I did was say something, but actually it's like I just slapped you. Anyway.
But that right there is just a quick note.
Because I'm also thinking about that violence you talked about where somebody comes from you. And that actually right there makes me think of the topic we've talked about, philosophy of self-defense, actually. Like the very fact that this is going to occur inevitably, especially in a world without givens, all the more reason that you need to be prepared to handle that and respond well. There's more to be said on that, but basically, well, if we have people that are not linguistically, I want to say, trained, then all they know what to do is say, hey, it seems to me like you're emotionally cheating. They don't have the training to be able to be like, hey, I'm speaking with you today because there are some situations that I've seen that seem unwise. It seems as if you are putting yourselves in situations that could create intimacy when you are already in a relationship. But also, I don't know your perspective. And one of the reasons I'm telling you this is because I would want to hear it. Because what is intimacy anyway? People have different views of that. So I would like to hear. That took a whole lot longer to say. But it also is sending so many signals of this is what we're talking about. But I'm also creating a space for you to speak. And I don't know. You're saying all of that. I don't know for sure. I don't have certainty. The gauntlet is not down. Something has been assessed, but that's it. There's a big difference between assessment and judgment, as I like to put it. It has been assessed that this has occurred, but that's not the same as judging. Most people judge, they don't assess. Most people say, the way we put it in the paper in Mouth is Indestructible, is that most people say you are a liar versus you lied. The difference between you are a liar, which is judgmental, and you lied is a huge difference. Because you are a liar implies essence and being. That's judgmentalism. To say you lied is an assessment. You lied. That's just a fact. But since people don't know the difference between judgment and assessment, they're either really nervous to judge and they never do and they get taken advantage of, or to assess, or they say screw it and they're judgmental all the time because they think it's impossible not to, right? Because what, are we just going to deny reality or something like that? But this would suggest the importance of philosophical distinctions. And where else are you going to get those but philosophy? Ergo, to me, actually, this kind of topic, if anything for me, is a real good case study for why philosophy matters. It's actually these kind of situations. These for me are like, actually, philosophy started for me from these kind of situations. Because it started with the question that my grandmother said. And I told you, she's like, no one gets married planning to get a divorce. And I went, oh my gosh, no one gets married planning to get a divorce. Then wait, that means people think they won't get a divorce and they do. And that means, how do you trust your brain? And how do people, like, how does that happen? Because when you get married to someone, you're like really invested in them. And yet that person you're invested with, stuff happens that then you don't want anything to do with them. How can that occur? Oh, life must be way more weird than we thought. Like, time and dynamics must be much more hard to navigate and figure out. And that actually for me is a kind of, you could say, a birthplace of wonder. Like, how does that occur? How do relationships create dynamics that create all of these unexpected results? Like, it's a birthplace. I think it's a birthplace of philosophy. I really do. But there's more to be said, but I will stop and give it to Mr. Rivera. Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really happy to hear you guys' thoughts, because I can say that because it was my family that I could not control, like, the injustice that might be happening. Like, it was just like, I was just like, oh no, I cannot stand by and let this kind of assessment or judgment just go through. And it's, again, what's interesting, I always like coming back to 500 Days of Summer as a movie, because I don't know if you listen to Gordon Levitt when he talks about his character in 500 Days of Summer. And to me, this is the real philosophical fantasy of love, is that if you watch 500 Days of Summer and you go, wow, Summer really isn't a nice girl. Well, that's interesting, because there's nowhere in the movie that shows Summer's perspective. It's all Gordon Levitt's perspective. If you watch that movie and go, Zooey Deschanel's at fault, I have a lot of questions, because everything surrounding that movie, it's like little glimmers of the real coming through. But the character is so immersed in their own fantasy that they can't even listen to the little small glimmers of Zoe being like, I don't believe in love, or I just want to be friends, or even his friends being like, hey, are you sure, like, this is the girl? Because you kind of always say that all the time, right? Like, just little glimmers like that. And you realize that when you understand Gordon Levitt's story as this character, he's done nothing but put words in Zooey Deschanel's mouth. And eventually ends up being a hurtful experience for him. And somehow he still believes it's like her fault. And I'm always very concerned about this, like, on an ethical level, because, like, I'm very passionate about this ethical injustice, because for me, I would rather not us paint each other as villains before someone has gotten the chance to actually speak their own truth on the matter. And if we only paint each other as villains before the other one has had the chance to speak, well, that already makes the worst foot that you could possibly have. Everybody's a villain, because nobody's giving each other a chance to speak. And now we live in a situation where everybody feels wrong. And then we reach what I call the rational impasse, where it's, you owe me what you did to me. And then they go, no, you owe me what you did to me. To me, that is the most beautiful example of a rational impasse. And you can't even escape it, because what that requires for a human being to do is too great to, if they haven't prepared for it, it is too great for them to say, okay, maybe everybody's innocent in this situation. Maybe we all made the wrong assessment. Maybe we made the wrong judgment. Maybe if we had just had a conversation about what we accused each other of, maybe we would have understood. All of these are maybes. So it greatly concerns me when we can flip that switch, like this. That's, like, to me, the scariest part, is the fact that we can, once we're hurt, we go therapeutic weaponization. Like, I don't know why that's what we do, but, like, that's what we do. We go straight into therapeutic weaponization. oh, they're manipulative, oh, they emotionally cheated on me, oh, they were making microaggressions, oh, they were doing this. And it's really hard to like throw off those charges because they're so like, it's like they're like ghosts. Like you can't really pin them down like on people because when you ask them like, okay, so what did this person do exactly? Like, you know, and it's so hard to pin down. And then we have this question of gaslighting. Gaslighting is like, I think, the most wonderful philosophical problem to think through because it's on the fundamental insanity of trust, right? So how do we prove that trust has been broken? Well, that's kind of weird because if you don't trust them in the first place, well, you're always going to say trust has been broken. Um, and there seems to be this weird gap between, well, what if they're just saying that they agree to this, but actually they don't agree to this, and actually they're just gaslighting me, or actually they're just manipulating me into this agreement that they didn't do what was wrong and that it was just a misperception, quote, quote. And if I secede to this, then it's possible I'm being gaslighted. Well, that has a lot of issues. Because in my opinion, in some sense, we have to wonder how much of the deception. I feel like there's a certain degree of deception that doesn't matter unless I feel that it matters. So let me give an example. So if someone says they weren't emotionally cheating, now I could say that's a deception and they're lying to me. Well, the problem with that is, like Lacan says, what if they were emotionally cheating? What are you gonna do? Like what is it that you need to do to get emotionally cheating? Right? Do you need them to confess? Because obviously you've already judged that they're emotionally cheating. So there's a part of the deception that almost doesn't matter because you have already judged what the deception is. You have been like, well, you emotionally cheated. And they're like, no, I didn't. And they're like, well, you're gaslighting me. So there you go. So like, you know what I mean? Like you've already made the judgments. Like you're at this point, you're just playing like a one-sided game. Like it's a one-sided game at this point. So to me, what is the benefit of saying, well, what if they're just manipulating? Okay, what if they are? Does that change anything about your thing? If you can't get them to confess the truth, and this is what it hinges on, and you don't trust them because it's truth and trust. You can't have truth without trust. And then, so if you don't trust them from the get-go, well, it sounds like we can't even begin anything. So what is it that you're upset over exactly? This is what I prod into a lot about people getting upset over possible manipulation, because possible manipulation assumes that your trust is still intact, but you're doubting its solidity. But here's the thing. If you doubt what they say because they're manipulating you, then you no longer trust them. And it's it's out of the bag already. Like it kind of, in some sense, this is when I feel like it's most obvious that the relationship is over. Because if you feel somehow in your mind that they will never confess this thing that they did, whether true or not, then, well, we have nothing to go off of anymore because trust is gone. Trust is completely eliminated from the picture. Because what it requires is for them to, whatever they say, you have to believe as true. To me, like that is a demand. If they say something to you and they say, hey, look, I did not do this, I have to trust them unless I really see evidence contrary. I cannot be saying things like, well, I feel like you could just be saying that to appease me. If you play that game, it's over. And I feel like, and I'm going on a long rant right here. But I've learned in my own relationship that I can almost like gamble this probability. 90% of the probability is straight up miscommunication and the fact that we never talked about it. Like, it's like tropishly funny how 90% of the problems is exactly that, but our anxiety gets the best of us and we start going into these loops of insanity where we say, yeah, but you're just saying that to appease me. And it's really hard for your partner to overcome that because you already took the words out of their mouth. You already said, hey, I don't believe what you're saying because you could be saying something else. How can you have a relationship like that? You can't. It's impossible. It's like literally impossible. So like to me, it's to me there's it's trust or die. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm wrong.
Oh, so this toothpick holder was given to me in high school, and it has about 10 aged toothpicks. And this topic is really important, so I'm going to take one of my aged toothpicks. That's from, I believe, John Sherlin. So thank you, Mr. Sherlin. Okay. Yeah. So basically, for me, life is a whole lot about avoiding, I've called them indestructible maps, internally consistent systems, entrapments, auto-cannibalistic, self-eating structures. We could even say whirlpools. And that, because everything you described is what I would call internally consistent system. There's a logic that has an answer for everything, and the person is entrapped. There's no way to get them out. Like, that's ultimately what, there's always an answer, right? They have this, so they're stuck, right? I call these indestructible maps, okay? They're in relationships, they're in worldviews, they're in politics, they're everywhere. Everywhere. And I would say it's possible that 95 to 99% of the world is trapped in some indestructible map. And most people's lives are just locked in this thing. It's like C.S. Lewis says, hell is locked from the inside. Everything, that kind of dynamic that you were describing again, and Michelle and I, that is where philosophy starts for us, is seeing this and going, people are trapped in a dynamic. There's different languages, a dynamic that they just can't get out of. I was talking with Jockin last night about how in relationship, it's like people are in these whirlpools that they can't get. And the only way is to remember what happened in the past and to start seeing a pattern. That's the form. Well, if you don't have good memory, you can't see the pattern. And also critically, virtue and memory are tied together. And so if you don't have virtue, then you can't remember as well. You can't see clearly. So you end up in a pattern. Oh, and guess what happens when people are in relational stress? Well, they get worse health, and health and virtue are tied together. They get worse virtue, then they get worse memory, so they're less likely to see the pattern, which then makes, they're stuck. They're freaking stuck. And that's how people for decades end up in this, and they don't make any progress. And basically, Jockin is stressing that health should be tied to, well, and I agree, not doing that. But we tend to think about health as simply, well, not dying. It might be okay to die if this is where you are, right? That's a horrible thing to say, but people in a sense are already dead. Certainly they've reached, as they might have health in the sense of survival, but they don't have health. They're not going to shine. They won't have the vibrancy of life. Avoiding internally consistent systems is the business of philosophy, if it has any business at all. Identifying them, seeing them, and charting a path through them, because you must use maps. Oh, frick. I have to be a mist and use dynamics, and all of them tend toward an enclosure. Well, I guess we're screwed. No, that's where the girdle point in the encounter, there's only one principle, is the encounter of dynamics, the metaxis. That's where the girdle, that's your only hope. And that's why the face-to-face is so big. One might hear that and say Levinas, the face, right? Well, yes, but I think basically the face that you don't want to see. That's where the Ivan Illich is big. It's not just the face and learning to see the face. It has to be the man on the side of the road who is disgusting. And one of the things that's just so interesting, there's a real sense in which the problem of the world, there's all this talk, and I can't remember, I've mentioned this before, I'll mention it again. There's all this talk of the problem of relativism, right? Like there's relativism. There's a very real sense in which the problem is we're not relativistic enough. Because when people get into these situations, they ain't freaking relativists. They know right and wrong. That person's wrong, dang it. There's no relativism. Relativism only applies when you want to do something and some old law says you shouldn't do it and you disagree. But when people get in personal dynamics, they ain't relativists. They are absolutely moral dogmatists. There's people ain't relative. There's a sense in which people say God is dead, there is no truth. Apparently God's not dead enough, because when you get into relational dynamics, the big other is real big. And yes, and then what you see is like if people really believed God was dead and that there was no absolute truth, they'd be in a situation and go, I don't know, maybe the person has it. That's what they would say, but they don't believe God is dead, actually. They're like, nah, God ain't dead. That person's an a-hole. God told me, basically. So, the moral absolute, right? So there's a very funny way in which, again, we haven't saturated relativism, I suppose, to use Mr. Ebert's language. We haven't gone through it. We've just kind of dabbled with it. The problem is we're dabbling with it, not really going through. And actually, if you went through, I think if you actually take relativism to its extreme, you end up in a place where you say, I have no choice but to ask their opinion. Like it comes through to saying, well, all we have is the encounter in the space of us entering, right? And so if I don't meet them in relation to hold their side, there's nothing to go on, right? Because the concrete encounter of the face is all we have in their perspective, and that leads to conditionalism and encounterology and the surprise. Like if you take relativism to its extreme and actually say, no, God is dead, well then all we have is the encounter. All we have is the person. All we have is the surprise. And that's where the Holy Spirit dwells, quote unquote, to use that that idea. I think, there's so many more things. I can't stress enough the rational. Yes, abso-freaking-lutely. The rational impasse happens. If you say, well, that person has to see that they're wrong before we'll let them back in. Well, then they're never getting back in. That's not gonna freaking happen. If they say, well, they gotta see where I'm coming from before I'll talk to them. How can they see where you're coming from if you don't talk to them? People create a rational impasse. There's only, it is exactly where the non-rational screams at you. The only thing is to do something non-rational, which seems irrational. They hurt me, but I'm gonna go talk to them. That's insane. Why would you do that? It's irrational to do that. They hurt you. Actually, it seems irrational, but it's non-rational. But the problem is, as we've talked about the phenomenology of the non-rational feels irrational at the time. It feels like you're going against it. You have to train yourself from experience, memory, and working on anxiety to know that which you're tempted to say is irrational and therefore you shouldn't do it is actually non-rational and the only way to get through the rational impasse. When you start, well, I would say without philosophy, you're basically doomed to do this. Like, when somebody hurts you, it seems rational not to talk to them. You will never leave that place. You will never, ever leave that place unless you get, I'd say, some inquiry that goes, well, that understands the importance of the non-rational. Because all you would ever interpret that is irrational and worse yet, in a sense, unethical. They're a bad person and you're relating to them. It's irrational and unethical, actually. You're a bad person if you go talk to them. You absolutely shouldn't do it. What chance do you have to break through that logic without philosophy or religion or theology or experience? Where would the thought even occur to you? What if it's actually non-rational because it's the only way you get through a Nash equilibrium rational impasse? Where would that thought come from? Where would that thought come from if you didn't have philosophy or if you weren't going to a church where a pastor said you should love your enemies? Like, where would you, and we're like, well, no, I'm not going to love my enemies, you idiot. But if the pastor's like, well, God said so and he died on the cross, you're like, well, maybe I'll force myself to think this stupid thought. And because you force yourself to think this stupid thought for a long time, eventually you go, okay, I've been to 500 Bible studies and they keep saying this. Maybe there's something to it. But, and then you do it. But if religion goes away, people ain't doing that crap. So what other chance do you have than a philosophy that introduces the idea of non-rational to you? Right? Why would you ever think? Why would you ever think? You're not. So you're doomed. You're damned. You're stuck in the internally consistent system. And here's the problem with an internally consistent system. You're not trapped in anything at all. You're in isness. You're in reality. You're not in a system. You have the right understanding. You are completely correct. There's nothing to ever think that would make you realize you are in the wrong. The problem is there's no problem at all. And so you never change. And so this is how you spend your life. And the decades go on and on and on, and you go to your grave absolutely correct. Seth.
This is really, I'm enjoying this conversation. When Javier was saying, yeah, in a relationship, there's these impasses, I was thinking, I read a book a number of years ago. There's multiple authors, and I don't remember their name, but they're all from Harvard, and they were on this some sort of team that, trains people in mediation. And so the name of the book is just Difficult Conversations. And the thesis of the book is there are only 3 difficult conversations. Every difficult conversation is one of these 3. It's either, the first difficult conversation is what really happened. So there's what I think happened, there's what you think happened. The second one is, what kind of a person are you actually? Right? So it might be some incident, but really what we're talking about is your character, is what the discussion turns into. And then the third is, whose feelings are the most important feelings? That's the third category. And I don't know, I mean, maybe there's a fourth difficult conversation, but I think it's a pretty elegant, thing. And, the point of the book, I mean, it's been a year since I read it, before I met Daniel and Michelle, but I feel like it's essentially talking about, you have to be able to see that there's an enclosed system, and you have to be able to make a non-rational move. One of the things that I'm thinking again of Guy and circling. So the catchphrase in circling is, we're trying to get this person's world. And I think one of the real tricks that tricks the trade maybe that we have to learn. I mean, I think it'd be valid in many situations just to say this person is enclosed. All they're doing is repeating their labels, and there's nowhere to go, right? And maybe there's a certain amount of effort I can put into this conversation before it just doesn't feel worth my while. But it could be like in Javier's case, it could be a family member. I mean, I have a teenager. Sometimes I sit with her and I'm thinking, well, this is just but it's my goal to bring my teenager into a place where we can actually relate and talk about something and say, well, maybe the world's like this, but maybe it's like that. Let's discuss. So one of the tricks, I think, is to be able to maybe on the one hand, listen to a person and say, well, they're enclosed in a reality that is leaving out a whole bunch of the rest of reality. And yet, what does it feel like inside of their enclosed system? Can I understand, based on the logic that they are working with, why they would come to that position? Because I could, say, well, you're just repeating some ideological thing, but it's like, oh, okay. For all you know, your ideology does explain the world. And therefore, if I bring up X, Y, and Z, you are going to say 1, 2, and 3 in response to that. And how did, we even have to maybe come into well, how did you come by your ideology? I mean, of course, it's all very inconvenient and impractical if we're trying to get somewhere in the next 5 minutes because someone said X is happening and I need to know the right move, or I need to know if you're on my side or not. But I mean, I think one of the things that maybe it's a gesture we can make is just simply like, well, this is not a quick conversation. You're treating this like a quick conversation. There's a lot that's coming up for me. If you really want to know what I think, you might need to like get on my appointment calendar because, you know, like this is a big deal. You know, and I think, I don't know, but I am curious, you know, just because it's, I think the situation, we're running into it more and more and more. You know, you go, you know, out into the world and you're going to run into people who are in their little system. And I wonder, I mean, I think one of the, you know, a lot, I always hope that, you know, O.G. Rose is going to go to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. But, you know, before that happens, I wonder if the bumper sticker version of the map is indestructible could at some point reach wider consciousness. Like, oh, it's a good assumption when I go out into the world that people don't have the same givens as me. Like, I wonder if that could actually become, because to me, and I think, you know, knowing you guys has helped me articulate it this way. But I mean, at this point, having thought about this now for a while, it's almost a given that when I meet someone new, they're not going to have my givens. That's a given. But I think there's a way that people haven't even yet gotten outside of that. It's just like, what? You don't have the same givens as me? Like, you don't have the same starting assumptions as me? Well, that's crazy. And just last thing I want to mention, I think you said the ethical and the rational together, just to come back to that, is like, yeah, you could be wrong, but the other thing that you can be accused of is you're crazy. And you know, so these are the things that we have to contend with now.
Yes to that. And absolutely. So if there's one little phrase where if the average person on planet Earth went outside and he said, you know what, people might not have the same givens, there we go. That's a simple principle. We can go from there, because you're right. Yeah, critically, yes, it becomes a new working given. It becomes a new given to you, a new standard. You say people don't have givens. Well, it's given then that they won't. That is how I will operate. It changes everything, and it's necessary. Well, again, one of the things that helped people avoid the problem of internally consistent systems or maps is if people were all under the given of Christianity, then the church was like, you must forgive. Like, you had an indirect way to address the problem of maps that everyone agreed to in believing in God, that indirectly, without articulating it like we are doing, would practically create a culture that increased the probability that this problem would not become so dire. But in removing, basically we removed givens before we were ready for the problem of indestructible maps. Because to me, those are very related. Like, when we went from the age of givens to now we're in the age of maps, which is what we're describing, entrapments internally. So we're in the age of maps now, and we have no freaking idea what to do. And also it's a map proliferation. It's just proliferating into all different forms, you know, philosophies of gaslighting, conspiracies, new religious movements. You have all of these internally consistent systems that are developing, and people are going out and encountering it, and people say, well, I feel this, you feel this, well, I guess we're dead. Like, all anyone is doing is encountering rational impasses left and right, left and right, left and right. And it's just one giant game theory problem. Yeah. Also, you said something really important about, well, what if by their logic, whoa, wait, you're understanding the situation by their logic instead of yours? Wait a minute, hold on. You're going to be taken advantage of. Yeah, that's actually, the last paper, this toothpick from 20 years ago is pretty great. It has a really good flavor. I pulled out an age one, Michelle, because this is like ground zero of what is everything for philosophy, as we talk about all the time. It's just, yeah, this is so important. It's really important, is that, like, when you, like, the last paper in the map is indestructible is critical thinking, which is, what is critical thinking? Most people think critical thinking is you thinking harder. No. Critical thinking is when you become a critic of your thinking. What does a movie critic do? They don't just, a good movie critic don't say, I like it, I don't like it. They look at the structure. They form it. They look at it. They become a critic of their own way of seeing the experience, right? So critical thinking, I strongly believe that empathy is critical thinking. Like empathy is critical. You literally can't critically think without empathy. But what is empathy? Empathy is not emoting with a person. It's entering into their logic, trying to think through their logic, not their emotions, their logic. Because the emotions will come if you get the logic. So you try to enter your logic. Well, ladies and gentlemen, freaking empathy is then a philosophical activity. You can't have empathy without philosophy. You can't do it because the only way to have empathy is to enter the logic of another person. And how else are you going to do that without the gambit of skills that philosophy affords? Because by definition, you can't enter another person's consciousness. So isn't this doomed to fail? Like, isn't empathy doomed to fail? Yes, empathy will fail. But philosophy is all about failing better and failing better, and understanding not all failures are equal. Oh, well, also, failure just means we don't get certainty, but that doesn't mean we can't get confidence and that we can't actually advance, right? So empathy, and basically, I mean, how are you going to relate with people without empathy? Like, everyone hears that and says, you have to empathize if you're going to have relationships. Okay, so you're saying we need philosophy. That's what it means. If you say, I have so many notes, I'm going to give it to Rivera. If you say empathy is necessary for relationships, philosophy is necessary for relationships, period. End of story. That's how it's going to be. So therefore, because we don't have philosophy to identify that empathy is philosophy, therefore empathy becomes emotion, and you can't have empathy. You see how it's an entrapment. It's an internally consistent system, right? So let me give it to Javier. Mr. Rivera and then Michelle. Mr. Rivera, please. Yeah, so empathy is philosophy. Mr. Rivera.
So this is my honest assessment of myself. When you begin to unstuck yourself from an internally consistent system, what you will begin to experience, now, I don't know what all of your experiences are, but I can tell what my experiences are, is that there is a remaining residual from unstucking yourself. And what my experience is precisely this experience. So I have my problems with my family, but I've come to the conclusion that actually, if you go into their world, it's nobody's fault. Everybody has played off of some type of internal consistent system. The problem, and what I mean by the residual, and this is the hard part, to me, this is probably the more brutal part, because this is what would make somebody go back into the self-stuckness, is when you discover that it's no one's fault, what do you do with the pain? Where does that pain go? That is where I'm at in my own assessment, and that's what I call the residual. It's not a perfect transition, but it's a residual, because what's happening is you're starting to understand that what we have suffered from is a series of rational impasses. Now, this is very brutal for the consciousness to confront, because what you have to confront is, well, hold on. I think I might have built my whole life about a lie. And I am suffering, and it's not true. But it is true because I am suffering. So this is what I call a residual of, and I think when you understand that there's a residual here, there is a temptation. In my experience, there is a real temptation to go back and say, you know what? Actually, it felt so much better blaming somebody right now. Like, it felt so it is unbelievably better to blame someone for this, because at least you have a direction about where the pain could go, about where the pain could make sense. If the pain doesn't make sense, and again, this is me using a rational temptation, well, then where does the pain go? Right? Like, I am tempted by this thing all the time, right? This is what I'm struggling with. But I notice it kind of makes a Hamlet situation. That's what I feel like actually starts coming out as a kind of Hamlet situation, which is I want to get closer to my family. And I know it's not their fault, but I can't do it. I can't bring myself to do it. Right? Like, I understand that it's no one's fault, but I actually can't do it. I actually can't bring myself to do it. And so to me, this residual is like a very it's probably the closest to truth that I could be in my life, because it's the most painful and the most revelatory, right? Because you can see, right, you can see that you're like all I can imagine is like I am like halfway out the door of hell, and I'm going, actually, now that I can see that I can get out, do I want to get out? Like, now that I know that the door is open, I could get out, but like, do I want to get out? And so you're stuck midway between this. So that's something that I wanted to add to that. And the last thing, Seth, that you said was, you really made me think of the philosophy of acting, because it's funny that empathy and this, like, I like that you brought up that book because it makes me want to read it, is the three difficult questions is when you start prodding into the character of that person, that's what an actor has to understand, right? How do I portray this character correctly? Well, I actually have to understand their world, because if I don't understand the world, it's not about memorizing the script. It's about understanding what the script emanates that is of their world. What is it that the character wants? What is it the character is trying to get? What is it that the character can't get? And that's only then do you actually understand the script. It's not about saying it perfectly. And this is how you know people are bad actors, because everyone's saying, hold on, that's not in the script. Say that again. That's not in the script. So what you realize is that the only way to overcome this rational impasse is that half the time we're bad actors. To be good actors, we actually have to realize that we're not acting, that we're fully immersed in whatever character that it is. And I do think it's exactly the way Daniel describes it, which is it's empathy. How can you empathize with a character? Actually, I've heard a really interesting take from Al Pacino on villains. He said they said something like, "So how do you feel about playing villains?" He's like, "Honestly, if you look at them like a villain, you can't empathize with them. You have to understand that what we call this villain has complex motivations and intentions. If you only paint them as a villain, you can't actually empathize with them. It's impossible. You can't actually properly act what they are attempting to do." So I find that brilliant. I think if we look at the movie Joker, Joaquin Phoenix empathizing with the Joker, really, I mean, I think that was the first time people actually saw the Joker in a kind of human light. They saw that the Joker was a manifestation of social consequences, like a series of social failures that the Joker kind of manifested, right? And only someone that could empathize with the character could show something like that. Versus the Joker's just the villain. It's like, well, yes, they may be villains now, but notice how even in anime, when you hear the villain speak, the supposed villain, they always have like this really complex intention and motivation about it all, that you're like, actually, you know, that does make sense. That does make sense that they would do that. I think they're wrong, but it makes sense that that's the logic that they would come to after them suffering so much pain. But yeah.
Oh goodness, Michael, good to have you. We're talking about really important stuff, about relationship philosophy, and oh my goodness, the residue, okay, yes. When you come to realize that everyone is in an internally consistent system, and then I'll give it to Michelle, and this is called everyone's pain, and it's nobody's fault. It's the nature of reality for people to end up in a logic that makes them create all this pain for one another, and it's nobody's fault. What do you do with that? What do you do with that? And like you say, it feels way better to say, you know what? I'm just going to go blame somebody because I'm going to send the energy that way. This is the cross, like in Christianity. A lot of people use the phrase of cross, like Jesus takes up his cross and I got to bear my cross. And it basically means hardship. I've got to bear a hardship, like a difficulty. That's fine. In my opinion, the cross represents a much more deep metaphysical reality, which is the residue, as you're terming it. Because the Pharisees are 100% correct. Jesus is a heretic. He is making terrible claims. The Pharisees, they're enemies, they're bad guys. No, Jesus is objectively doing everything that the Torah says you should not do. He is absolutely doing terrible things. It's completely reasonable to think we need to kill this guy, right? We want to see the Pharisees and the Sadducees as these devils, right? And I'm not trying to say they were saints, but they're no more saints or devils than any of us. They are stuck in an internally consistent system. And how in the world, if someone came along and say, well, Pharisees, Sadducees, don't worry, this guy actually is the Messiah. Okay, I'm not, nowhere in our internally system. How do we think that? How do we think the event? You don't think the event. Dang it. You like, if the Messiah shows up, the Messiah must be killed because the Messiah can't be intelligible to the internally consistent system. Likewise, whatever the non-rational action is that will break the rational impasse must be killed. It must be attacked. It must be destroyed. Right? And the person who's doing it thinks the same too. They're like, this sucks. I want to blame someone. Like, so the non-rational actor is the one that everyone in their system's like, that's the one we want to kill, because it would also open the thing up. And also they stand outside the intelligibility. And the person themselves is like, really would be easy just to blame someone, right? And Jesus has to be in a place. There is no doubt. Like, Jesus was tempted, right? You don't think Jesus was like, you know what? I think I'm just gonna blame man for the fall. You know, I think like you guys keep doing this sin thing. You don't think Jesus was like, y'all the sinners here, right? But he completely justified. I'm sure that was a heck of a temptation, right? And would Jesus have been wrong? No, it was their fault. It is humanity's fault for sinning, right? If Jesus would have thrown down the cross and been like, you know what? F you people. Like, would Jesus have been in the wrong? Absolutely not. Trying to crucify an innocent man, trying to help? Absolutely not. And yet, the entire cosmos hangs on Jesus not doing the rational, justified thing, bearing the residue. I think also, honestly, what you're describing of the residue, which for me I associate with the girdle point, and everything is about maintaining the tension of the girdle point, where the map is unveiled to not, the correspondence and consistency breaks down. What you are describing is the girdle point. The girdle point is the only possibility of unleashing the Holy Spirit. Only way you unleash the Holy Spirit is bearing the cross, etc., so forth. Basically, we can't do it. So, you know what the theological answer is like, yeah, the only entity that can bear the residue is God. So you give it to God, and God bears the cross, and he dies for your sins, etc., so forth. And you just say, thank you, God, because I couldn't bear it, right? Basically, now it's beauty. Beauty has to bear it. Like, if you're in the residue and you're like, what would make you not give in to the temptation to go back and just blame someone? Beauty. Geopadia. That of which you have to experience to taste. If you would only not, if you truly believe that not afforded possibilities that otherwise would not. Like the geopadic. Like friendship, like virtue, like a caliber of engagement that otherwise was not possible. But there would be no, but here's the other move. It's not guaranteed that if you bore it, that would happen. What if the geopadia never comes again? What if, beauty never comes again, even if it exists? There's always the possibility. Well, that's the dark night of the soul, right? You know, there had to be the possibility. Jesus had to feel what is it that Jesus had to feel in his final moments? My God, why have you forsaken me? That must be the very real possibility of the residue. But that is the very real possibility that affords beauty, geopedia, and the only things that make life worth living. But if that's not even a concept in your mind because you haven't done philosophy or theology, you're going to blame someone. You're going to blame, of course you are. Like, where would the thought come from that you shouldn't? It feels terrible not, so it's rational too. Therefore you will, right? The problem of always being at risk of entrapment in an internally consistent system and logic cannot be overstated. It is an ever-present danger.
It keeps kind of giving out there, Michelle. Oh,
I just want to say Michelle is making the non-rational move right now.
yeah, she is. She's actually great.
Thank you, Michelle. You know, she's bearing the residual. So that works out very, very well. But let me throw it to Michael. So yes, I think the residue bearing cross, it is always rational to kind of pass it, to take blame. But look, that's why everyone is moving to blame. They don't, but that also, to me, people enjoy blaming. They enjoy blaming, dang it, because the residue is not enjoyable. So they enjoy blaming someone, even as they say, this is hard for me right now, right? Like, this is hard for me right now. It's really difficult for me to say this and come forth and do what, but you're an evil person. Okay, because that's also critical where people like, this is a really hard thing for me to tell you, but everything you do is wrong. Was it really that hard? Because, but there's an enjoyment in that compared to the residue. And most people are trying to avoid the residue. I think that's such an important notion. Once you realize the problem of internally consistent systems, the problem of maps, you're stuck with a residue. Everyone is hurting one another, and it's nobody's fault, and yet it is their fault, and yet it's not. It is the logical outcome of their logic according to its internal consistency, of which they can't see outside of because they're in the internal consistency. So it's really not their fault because they can't see the situation to make it so they could see that it is their fault. What do you do with that? You have to do something. What do you do with that? You're stuck. Bam. Michael, let me throw it at you. It's good to see you this evening. We're talking about stuff.
Great to see you. And what a question to, throw out to have me try and tackle. But I just started listening to, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Rest is History podcast. Tom Holland is one of the hosts. I can't remember the other host name, but I started listening to this series on Hitler's rise to power. And I'm on episode 3 now, and they're just getting into kind of the events leading up to the invasion of Poland. And I've just found it so, I mean, obviously so upsetting and like, just, yeah, like really unsettling in a lot of ways, but really interesting because like they reference a lot of these like firsthand accounts of, either speeches Hitler gave or, like conferences he had with, other world leaders, like leading up, 1937, 1938, before the world war broke out, like what was his real, internal psychological landscape. And he like never wavers in his assessment of like both what he sees as like the plight of the German people at the hands of the Allies after World War One, and like the grave injustice like that had been waged against the German people. And then from that problem comes the creation of an internally consistent system of, okay, the German people are morally superior and are, very much like Israeli people believing they have, God provided, destined, possession of the land of Israel. He believes that for the German people, and just really has this like he really has it in for like the Czechs at first, and then that kind of just spreads to like okay, Czechoslovakia fell, then Poland fell, then, Britain and France, like, come at me, bro. Like, I'm gonna kind of take it to you too. And there's there's like just such vitriol and blame. And but what's interesting to me is like, I mean, that everyone kind of knows is like, kind of what precipitated the writing of Mein Kampf was like this antagonism. What was interesting to think about, and then to think about in the context of like what you just shared, Daniel, of like, despite being wronged, doing the non-rational of not blaming, you have someone like Chamberlain who comes in and he's like, he literally says in 1938, like, I think to Hitler, like, this is someone who I think can be reasoned with. And you look at that, like, even at the time, but especially now, and be like, there's as much as, you can admire him for like always trying to pursue peace, like, there's also a madness to that. um and so I guess the question is like, what is when you are dealing with, I mean, obviously Hitler's like a uniquely extreme example, but like, when you're dealing with someone or a situation that feels like beyond repair, and just like, so just kind of, this is, we've tried, we've tried not to blame, and we've tried to understand, and we've tried to reconcile, and um this is just like a situation that like can't be, I don't know, won in a game A kind of sense. Like, what is the non-rational move in that, in that situation? Um because, like, I think a lot of people look at someone like Chamberlain and they think that he was kind of this like cowardly figure. Apparently he actually wasn't at all. Like, he was very like, kind of very stubborn in his ways, to a fault. Um, but, certainly not someone who was just kind of like naively thinking like, oh, like, Hitler can just like, we can just like achieve diplomacy. Um, but I think his fatal flaw was believing that, oh, if we just gave Hitler what he wanted, he would know what enough was. And it's just clear Hitler was just fundamentally like not satisfied, and like addicted. Like, they say in the podcast, like, he was like addicted to like the game of war, like hoarding territory was like what he like got off on. Um, Anyways, I know now I'm like talking a lot about that, but that's just kind of been on my mind. But then I'll pass it back. What's interesting is I'm also listening to the audio book of this book called The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And if you don't know anything about his biography, is unbelievable. Like, he's this German who ends up getting executed, as part of this, like, he was part of this conspiracy to overthrow Hitler, like one of like 5,000 people that ended up getting, um, assassinated as part of this witch hunt conducted by Hitler. But he was this German theologian who like really stood up to the Nazis, like in the heart of World War II. And basically the thesis of this book is he makes a distinction between cheap grace and costly grace. And he says a lot of people, they pursue cheap grace, and they take the story of the fact that Jesus died for our sins to mean basically that they can kind of sin and fuck up, and like Jesus will just kind of absolve them of their sins. And there's no assuming of responsibility. There's no desire to actually learn from your sin and grow, and try and, like, God became man so man can become God. Like, there's no assumption of the responsibility to actually try and become more like God. And he argues for costly grace, which involves sacrifice, which involves humility, which involves giving up your impulses and your passions. And I think that's like a really relevant and very important like part of understanding what it means to be non-rational. Because it is like it's an anti-ego, like it's like an anti-ego move, to say, even though I've been hurt by you, I'm not going to deflect. I'm not going to let my ego get so injured that I just deflect that anger back to you. I'm going to, um, like I'm going to try and pursue what deeper relationality looks like. And that might involve like me being honest with you and saying like what you did really hurt me, and like and kind of just like stand up for yourself, like not kind of just like bend to the other person's will, but um like seeing relationality and belonging as the ultimate ideal, not like self-preservation, or not, I don't know, like individuality or whatever. But then I'm left with the question, like, what do you do when you're dealing with a person or a situation where the non-rational falls on deaf ears, right? Sometimes the non-rational is to leave the marriage after 30 years. Um, I don't know. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
So first, Bonhoeffer is very important, and that distinction between costly and cheap grace I use all the time. If we take the problem of internally consistent systems or maps seriously, and we make that our starting assumption that we go to understand a situation that it is likely to be explained by the problem of internally consistent maps, then we can suddenly begin going through all of history very differently. And we can go through all situations very differently, because you have to choose the heuristic by which the starting framework that you are going to assume is at play, unless the evidence forces you to look otherwise, right? And for me, basically, it's really useful when you kind of say, my starting assumption, if there's relational problems, is that it's a problem of maps. It's going to be a problem of enclosures. Until I am forced to say, no, that person is literally a murderer. Oh, okay. Well, this is pretty concrete. But even then, of course, we can start playing a little bit of the game, right? Because they, for some reason, are like, well, that person cheated on me. They have, or maybe psychotic, etc. Even in that situation, sometimes, like Al Pacino is telling us, the empathy needs to be there, right? But at least if there's someone who is a murderer, the response is clearer. That's what often we tend to say, this is objectively evil when the response is clearer, more so than we have a metaphysical justification. Meaning, well, if somebody murders, we put them in jail. We don't really debate that. Now, in the stuff that Javier is describing, we're confused. Therefore, we say it's not objective. But critically, people's judgment of objective evil actually comes from the clarity of response, not from a sort of metaphysical justification of knowing the difference between, say, killing and murder. Because actually most people couldn't tell you the difference between killing and murder. But even if you can't tell that, if it's like, okay, well, even if I don't know if that guy killed somebody or murdered them, I know they need to go away. So clarity of response kind of removes the burden, right? That all aside, you bring up World War II. There's a whole lot of people right now who are questioning the World War II consensus, and a whole lot of people that are going back and kind of saying, is this historic event a little more complicated than we thought, et cetera, so forth. And a lot of people are going, so we kind of teamed up. It basically looks like the Allies had to team up with Stalin to win, and Stalin seemed to have done, the communists seemed to have done some pretty unbelievably terrible things as they came into Germany, but it was okay because it was against the Nazis. And then all of the Germans who were put in concentration camps after World War II by the Poles, you see all of these different things, you go, so what's going on? What do we think of this? Rather we go into any of all of that, the point is the following. A lot more people are basically going, looks to me like internally consistent systems, more and more, right? I think we have done everything in our power to avoid the problem of internally consistent systems. And for me, a lot of people are now arguing, Jonathan Peugeot has said this. He has said this role of, he is arguing that basically the unquestionable moral evil of Hitler is what has held the world together for the last 70 years. Like, God is dead, but we know Hitler is the devil. So we know how to create the good and evil, right? And that's why fascism and being called Hitler has been like the worst of all possible things, because it's literally actually holding the world together to make the idea that Hitler is evil. Because if we don't know what is the good life or what is the beautiful, then the best we can do is know what is absolutely evil. And of course, what Jonathan Peugeot said is, you do know that the devil is worse than Hitler, right? What? The devil is worse than Hitler? Oh, well, I guess that is true. Oh, but wait, hold on, what do we do, right? You see this? See, literally, we are actually right now in an age where basically, in my opinion, the deniability of the problem of maps is running out. And we are in a place where we either have to face it and figure out how to tarry with it, or it will destroy us. Because basically, if the world is being held together by the World War II consensus, and which is the understanding of what was World War II, if that falls apart, then we're going to need new skills to hold society together, new capacities, right? Like empathy. Basically, the ability to handle the encounter of the other person. Because if we can't have the absolute moral compass of Hitler with Satan, well, then we're going to have to be able to meet people one-on-one, right? And so forth. Now, critically, when people are saying, Hitler is, the devil is worse than Hitler, they're not saying that Hitler didn't do unbelievably terrible things, Nazi doctors, etc., so forth. They're saying Stalin did unbelievable, terrible things. This other person, the CIA, did unbelievably terrible things. Like, everyone has done unbelievably terrible things. China with Mao, and yet Hitler has, the Germans have stood out in a unique, terrible way, right? And what's happening is people are just asking the question, why? Why has this been the focus? And the argument that more and more people are saying is we need it to be unique, to have a myth to hold the world together after the death of God. That is what people mean when they say the World War II consensus is falling apart. Now, of course, you can say that's false, and that's where the argument is. But this is my entire point. The very fact the argument is happening, means that there are cracks that are occurring in the social consciousness. And when that occurs, the only way you're not destroyed by that is if you're ready for the problem of internal consistency, which people are not. And ultimately, you're only going to be able to do it is if you can handle the residue that Javier is pointing to, which arguably people are not. And I think also then with that, on the question of what is the non-rational decision, basically the non-rational decision can only be determined in the raw encounter face-to-face of the person. What if there's nothing more than just choices? Retrospectively, you go back and you say, that was stupid and Chamberlain should have seen and should have known better, et cetera, so forth. But very, very often you kind of hear that in relationships where people are like, well, they did this and that was stupid and they should have known, but then the cause and effect gets going and spinning in different ways, right? And then we kind of need history. And thank you, Seth, for being here, sir. We need history to be black and white. That's ultimately what occurs, right? So basically what I'm getting at, and then I'll give it to Javier and Michelle, is if you take the problem of internal consistent systems seriously, and you realize that you need to think of all of history in those terms as that problem lurking around, you have to rethink basically everything. The American Civil War, the English Civil War, World War II, World War I, diplomacy, China, communism, fascism, everything comes onto the scene. And basically, for me, the theme of all these major historical events is one of the reasons we actually, in a sense, keep repeating history is because we, in my opinion, have not actually learned the main, I would say, kind of the main principle of history, which is the problem of internally consistent systems, which is isomorphic of the problem of relationships, because it's a gestalt. It is all the same. It is all the same problem on different scales of human activity manifesting And we haven't thought it because we are in an eternally consistent system and thus not interpret it. Because if we saw it, it would say something about ourselves and it would mean something for us. And we don't want that. But let me give it to Javier Rivera and then Michelle. Because hey, if we're, if this is an historic event, it could be happening in our family. Like if this happened in history, it could be happening in our family. Oh, frick. Then I can't separate studying history from what I do at home. Oh, dang it. The problem of internal consistent systems means that what happens in history is also happening at home. I rather them be separate. And I think that's part of it. So, Mr. Rivera, please.
Oh man, yeah. I mean, you're painting this very well with like the Hitler thing. I'm glad, Michael, that you brought up the Hitler thing because that really is like the almost like the epitome of like what we designate as evil. I even heard Zizek himself say, "Of course, evil exists because Hitler is evil," right? Which fundamentally, funny enough, that was actually a very hard disagreement I had with Zizek because I was like, if you make this move, we're gonna run into this problem. And I was very hesitant about that because it's like to me, like the key marker of any possible the key marker of where any possible mistake is made is when someone says, obviously, it's this. Like it's obvious that Hitler's so evil. That always concerns me because that means it's the one thing that we omit. And it's almost like a psychoanalytic trope. The one thing that you're not wanting to look at, the one thing you're not willing to investigate is the very thing that's obvious to you. And so that always concerns me when someone says something that it's obvious because actually when I had the conversation with my sibling about this whole moral obscurity over emotional cheating, they go, well, isn't that what every single person would want if they were in a relationship? And I was like, well, that depends. I was like, it depends on what the couple agreed to. It depends on what they understand from each other. I was like, we don't know any of that. I was like, but I don't take it for granted that they necessarily have your same concerns. Um, so that's one of the things. And then the other thing is I noticed that rational impasse and exchange are like one-on-one. Because what I've noticed is when someone says, "Oh, but you did this, and so I need you to do this," or "I'll do this, I'll man up if you man up," right? It's funny that rational impasse always involves a kind of exchange. And what I realize is that you're taking the exchange too literal. Like, exchange cannot be achieved in a direct way, which is my problem. Because every time I have this conversation with people that are not in philosophy, they cannot grasp what I'm actually trying to say, which is mutuality cannot be achieved directly. Mutuality, can I say that word? Mutuality is only achieved indirectly. Okay? Meaning, and like, how does this happen? How is it achieved indirectly? It's achieved indirectly when you realize when you do something for the sake of itself and someone also does something for the sake of itself, you realize that the achievement that you desire is precisely that exchange that is achieved through the for sake of itself. So if I love you for the sake of being you, the fixation should not be about what I haven't done for you. Because if you do for me because you love me, then there is no need to fixate on the exchange. It is because we love each other that we are willing to give. And we are willing to give merely to give because we love each other. You notice how if you add the other part of that formulation, if someone loves you for the sake of you, they're also willing to give for the sake of giving. And isn't it ironic that at that point, the exchange is possible? That at that point, the real exchange that we all desire is satisfied. The problem is when there starts to be some type of failing happening, we start shifting the gears. And what happens is we start fixating on the exchange versus the forsake of itself, right? And to me, that is the most dangerous part, because you will never even come close to moving yourself out of this "I love you for the sake of loving you" moment, because you start reaching that residue moment where you say, well, hold on, hold on, am I going to give without getting anything in return? Right? You start asking that question, and the moment you start asking that question, you say, whoa, hold on, it might be better to actually make sure that I receive what I want in return. And that is the temptation. And the moment you do that, you're at a rational impasse, because the person will say, well, hold on, I want to make sure that I get something in return from you. And what if they both collide? That assumes that what I want doesn't collide with what they want. And that is actually the biggest mistake that most people make, is they don't realize that the moment you're willing to throw all or nothing on your one value, you'll realize that most of the time the other person will throw all or nothing on the value that directly opposes yours. Directly opposes yours. It's like uncanny how all the time it's always a contrary value that completely negates yours. Always. Like it's amazing to me that most of the time it is exactly a contrary value that annihilates the other person's values. So this is something that, to me, I'm like, there's no way you can get out of this without philosophy. Like I've thought about this over and over again about how can you do this without philosophy, and I haven't come up with the answer for it. Because if you think about psychology, it's like, yes, psychology is great, or the psychoanalytic language is great, but then you don't have the tools to discern how you get out of this situation. Like all you can do is be like, oh, that's projection. Oh, that's the big other. Oh, but like, what about your big other? Like, what about your projection? Are you going to call that out in front of your partner? Like, no one's going to do that. So there's no way out of this other than the kind of bearing the cross that you're saying, Daniel. And this is why I feel like even I've been reading a lot of virtue ethics, like I said, and the one thing that concerns me is that they're so fixated on the judgment action paradigm, because they're like, okay, well, Aristotle promoted this idea of the exemplar, of practical wisdom, and the person that has practical wisdom knows what to do. And then all the virtual theorists will go, well, hold on, how do we know if can we tell has practical wisdom if really none of us are virtuous, or we're struggling to be virtuous? Because if you're not really virtuous, then how can you tell if someone's virtuous? Because there's a kind of perception problem, because what happens is what you perceive as courage when you're viceful is actually brazenness or something like that, right? You'll be like, that person's not courageous. They're just brazen. They're just being reckless, right? So if you have so many vices that you can't see courage in its true perception, then how can you tell when there's someone that actually has practical wisdom? So there's this impasse problem in virtue ethics. And what I notice is that they never start from the position of failure. They always go, how do we know? And I like to start from, well, let's start from, we made a mistake. We made a mistake. What do we do? I should probably forgive you. I should probably somehow manage this residual in some way. But we never start from the position of failure in ethics. It's always this kind of position of, how do we successfully determine a proper moral action from an improper moral action? And to me, this is what Jochen and I have talked about a lot, which is equity. Equity has always been the aftermath of justice, which is when justice fails, when there has been a mistake in the justice system, equity is what comes in to correct that injustice, right? But nobody talks about that. All the virtue theories that I've been reading has not talked about the position of failure when moral ethics have failed, when we have misjudged, I am starting to think that we have completely fooled ourselves in thinking about correct judgments. I think that is the most silly thing to waste on, because in my opinion, only when we start fixating on how do we deal with incorrect judgments is where ethical life begins, because that is where we're going to begin. That is where practical life is going to begin. Someone made a mistake. What do we do? Not how can we prevent this mistake? Because I feel like if you say how do we prevent this mistake, then you're falling possibly into another dogmatic internal consistent system. So that's why I feel like utilitarian falls into this kind of problem, because then you're like, well, whose maximum happiness are we going with? Who are we achieving with that from? Same thing with Kantianism. Like, okay, so we're all going to say the rule's correct, but like, what if someone fails? It's almost like it doesn't even account for failure, because it's like, actually you just didn't follow the law, the universal rule, right? So like there's no reason to follow the, think about aftermath of ethics. So I feel like there's a lot there about thinking from the failure point. And this is where I actually agree with Hegel. We have to think the failure point of ethics. And to me, equity, forgiveness is the starting point. To me, it's not when Jesus dies, it's how we look at each other after Jesus dies. Because every ethical situation seems to be to the point that, well, we were so blind that we didn't know what we were doing. And literally, Jesus says this, oh God, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And it's just, for some reason, it seems every ethical situation we find ourselves in, there's always a missing piece that we don't understand. So it seems to me the only way to begin in ethics is to say, yeah, we messed up. Somehow we messed up. Probably we should forgive each other and restart again. And it seems like the whole idea of resurrection, bearing the cross, seems to have a nice, healthy cycle to dealing with ethical problems. Because notice how when we talk about ethical issues, it's always a third body problem, like Daniel says. We actually almost talk about it like it's hearsay. Like, okay, so here you have a guy and he commits a murder, but his girlfriend didn't know. So what do you think about that? It's like really weird that ethical situations always have like this gossipy hearsay kind of vibe. Like you're just like, I don't know who this person is. I have no idea. And then they're saying like, so what do you think is the right answer? What do you think is the right answer? Who's wrong?
I completely agree, and I appreciate all of that. For me, basically, everything is about the judgment in the girdle point, faced with the problem of consistent systems. Like, for me, the word judgment in Aristotle with virtue ethics, I almost associate that with, rather than a kind of judgmentalism of this is right and wrong, but a certain of what is the mean for the situation. Like if I'm talking to people who are trapped in internally consistent systems, there's a way to speak that can contribute to the rage or help them see. And there's a kind of judgment in that measurement of speech and response that is going on. But basically, we can't think, like, basically, yeah, the major problem is right and wrong. That language is almost always in service of internal consistency, as opposed to, like, what is fitting. Fitting, that language, though, if you don't think the girdle point, is just going to fall back into being a word for right. If the word fitting, or like, is to be unique, not just a repeat of the word right, that's only going to be aware of the problem of internally consistent systems and managing and trying to hold the residue, right? So basically, for me, all of virtue ethics has to be situated, aware of the problem of internally consistent in the girdle point, and then it only makes sense in service of beauty. Like if it's for rightness, it's not a problem. Well, if it's not sufficient, but it has to be in the girdle point. I think that's very important. I think absolutely that when people get into exchange logic, you're almost screwed to start. Like instead of exchange logic, you need facing logic. Like the facing rather than the exchange. Once you have exchange, you've got trouble. I'll give it to Michelle here. I think I would also say to clarify for just a moment on what this idea of the end of the World War II consensus means. The idea is the following. Hitler has become the evil because otherwise, if people understood what the communists did to the Germans as they came in, some of the horrors are just absolutely incomprehensible, then America might have to explain itself for allying with the Russians. We can't explain ourselves, so to cover up having to do that, you have this emphasis on Hitler as the evil. Similarly, I find it very interesting that I never ever hear anyone mention the evils of Hiroto, Emperor Hiroto of Japan, right? Most people have no idea of who Hiroto is. Well, Japan did the rape of Nanjing. The stuff that Japan did is horrible. No one talks about Hiroto. You know, we say that's Hitler, not Hiroto. Why is that, right? Well, part of it is probably because we dropped the atom bombs on Japan. And that created a certain, if we talked about the evils of Hiroto, it's so close for people to say, well, you dropped the atom bombs and we don't have really a good response to that, so let's just not talk about it, right? Likewise, if you did not make Hitler the evil, there'd be the possibility of people going, well, Stalin was pretty horrific also, so what's going on with that? And you'd have to explain that, and you would lack a mythos to hold the world together. That's what kind of Peugeot is getting at in many people. If you can say that Hitler is the evil, then you can hold the world together with that mythos. If you didn't do that, then you would begin opening up these questions of, wait a minute, you know, what is America doing allying with these countries or working with these different countries? Or it's also very similar on, you could also say the same thing has happened with slavery being the evil, not a evil, the evil. Why is that? Well, because if you began looking at the American Civil War and you started going, well, the Confederacy believed that basically the Union was turning everyone into slaves, putting them into wage labor, taking them off the land. And basically the choice was between slaves that weren't in the factory or everyone being in a factory. If you saw that, well, then there would be the question of, well, are we all actually under a form of wage slavery now? Is capitalism just a form of a continuation of slavery? That's the kind of thinking you're invited unless you make slavery in racial terms the evil, right? Like you make it the. Like you always need the evil, like the big one, in order to not allow questions of something that may upset the order you have now, right? So that's what this idea of the breakdown of the World War II consensus is. It's the breakdown of something that has functioned as the evil, that has provided a order that if you lose that, what the heck is going to go on? But I would say this, in not facing this problem, you've basically invited exactly what's going on now. The return of people, these small fascist groups, these white nationalists, you have all these groups that are saying, hey, this stuff wasn't actually questioned, and since there hasn't been an actual philosophically trained conversation about it, you're inviting people to do it on your own, and we are seeing a horrific return to these small fascist states, and it will only intensify because small fascist states are inevitable in a world of the problem of internally consistent systems, because that is the onto-epistemological structure of small fascist states. So if you are in the world of the age of maps, the age of maps is the age of small fascist states. Unless you learn to bear the residue, there's no other option. And the clock is ticking. And if philosophy, because I'll give it to Michelle, and if philosophy is the only way, I agree with you, Javier. You go through it, there's nothing but philosophy. Then the spread of philosophy and the capacities that it affords are the only way to avoid, well, the return of a whole lot of small fascist states, of which then in response will be probably a unified global response to that, back and forth. And now we're looking at a repetition of the American Civil War, possibly on a global stage, basically, which would be unfortunate. There's more to say, but let me give it to Michelle here, and then I will give it to Michael, and I'll get my AIDS toothpick. Michelle, please.
It's great to see you all. Just 3 quick points. Some of them will jump back to a while ago. The first thing that I wanted to say was the logic. We were talking about the logic and hearing the other person's logic. Well, I think what's also interesting and what can also happen is when you like judge, you do recognize that your logic is different, but you judge that other person's logic only to come to find out that like it's your logic. Like you're judging their logic and it's actually your logic too. But it's just that you direct it toward a different thing. And so it seems like, you know what I mean? It's easy in your head to think, well, it's right when I think this way, but it's wrong when you think that way, except for the fact that it's actually like a totally, maybe it's a mirror image. Maybe there's something that's like a little different about it in the sense that you're like, oh, that's like, for example, Daniel and I have been talking about like the mirror image of selfishness is selflessness. Like when somebody's really, really servant-like, a lot of times that enables a selfish type of disposition from the another person. Okay. So like, just for example, but anyways, I just think it's really fascinating because a lot of times that like other logic will show us our own logic if we are able to be open to that and be able to be willing to see that. So yeah, anyways, I mean, it's a lot of like what Daniel will say, what you judge is what you become. So it applies in that too. I want to say that. But yeah, that's always a little bit of a freaky moment though, because you're just like, I'm convinced that your form of like your logic is not right and that's not right, except for the fact that like you're literally have the same logic and they're just literally showing it to you. So it's like, in a way, that frustration should be a moment to pause and slow down and then see that as a potential gift of like, wait a second. And this fits into another point I was going to say, which I didn't write down on my little piece of paper I scribbled on 5 seconds ago, but is that like I've really been like reflecting lately on the idea that the problem is the solution. Javier, you did a video like a long time ago on like obstacles or something, and like I remember it was a really good one. I think it was when you're like diving a bit into Nietzsche, maybe something else. I think it was Nietzsche, but anyway, it was really, really good. And it was like about like the obstacle being like the solution. But it's like it is the obstacle that is what you are going to be able to it's like it is the avenue for overcoming actually in the obstacle itself. So, and I think what's so beautiful about that, the obstacle's away. Thank you. That's a great way to put it, Michael. So what's so exciting about that is that it helps to unproblematize what we keep on fixating on the issue and the problem. And this is the problem when it's like, wait a second, it's actually, in a sense, it's a great thing that that's a gift again, because you can see that and you can look at that. And instead of trying to figure out how to get rid of that thing, like think about what that thing is. And maybe it could actually reveal to you what you need to do, like how you need to overcome that thing that you find to be an issue. So it's just kind of a rethinking of issues. Obviously, you may still be trying to have some sort of breakthrough, relief, whatever it is, freedom, but you know, there's a way in which you have to kind of see that as like something that's showing something about that issue is showing something to you about you, so that you can then be able to navigate through that as the way. And then, okay. Logic, what was the other key? Okay, right, pain. Okay, so the pain point you were talking about, Javier, I thought that was really, really good. And I don't know that I have an answer. Like, I mean, Daniel's already provided a great answer, in my opinion, on that topic of like the residue and what to do with that. It did make me think a little bit about the pain that can be felt in like obsessive love, where it's like, you almost would rather the pain than not feeling it, because it means you have to let go of that person. And that's like, it's almost like it's such a horrible place, because you're just like, I can stay in this hell pain of obsession or like, but never getting what you're wanting, right? Or you could say or like a breakup, right? It's like you have to like let go of that person, but you're like, I'd rather just sort of like remember painfully that person and how we were almost, whatever, we were together, whatever. But letting go of the pain, or I don't know, I think about it this way better, like letting yourself become fully consumed by the pain. Just let it hurt so bad. Let it hurt so badly that after that, you've kind of like burned out everything from you. Like everything's just burned up in this kind of fiery purification in a sense. So to me, it's almost like it made me think of that. I'm not sure that's relevant, but it's just what it made me think about, is like that it's that a point where you have to accept actually not feeling the pain, which feels painful, to not feel the pain because the pain felt almost easier, or you could at least feel like you still had a connection with that person. But now you have to let go of that and then realize you don't, you like, they're not, you know what I mean? They're not you, and they're not your projection, and they're not everything you were making them to be, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, I just think that's interesting, because it's sort of like, and it's sort of that moment of realizing like, oh wait, did it ever have to be painful? Wow. Like it's a very convicting thing, and it's sort of humiliating and heartbreaking, and it's, and in a sense, there's factors that are not your fault and your fault in a sense. And so for me, I think there's like this, it's that realization of like, wait, wow, it actually does, like, there's a way for there to be, like freedom in that pain, but almost the fact of having to have gone through that is like this, I don't know, it's a very, I want to say even that in and of itself is kind of painful to realize. But then there's like, I don't know, it just makes me think of the kind of a cracking open of like something being birthed. And so there's a lot of like emotion around that, but there's something of like, wow, there is a way in which I can let go of that pain too. Which is, again, like cognitively maybe painful, but then you realize like there is, like, I don't know, it's just kind of allowing yourself to realize you can actually be without that pain too. And that's like, that is a possibility, and kind of really sitting with that and sinking into that. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of like self-forgiveness there too that may need to occur. So, okay, I'll leave it there on that. And then the last thing I was going to say, philosophy is the only way. Right. Yeah. No, I feel that a lot. And I mean, I've been thinking, I definitely, like, my little head and world always goes to like the body and the earth and kind of like our environments and stuff like this, because I do think that these things, like how we move our bodies, you know, how much are we touching the grass? I mean, for real. But I do think these things matter. Maybe some people don't, but see, this is philosophy, right? Like, even to get to the point to say, hey, take off your shoes and go walk in the grass. Like, the fact that that might be good, is it good or bad? I mean, it is a type of philosophical move to kind of get you outside of your functional fixedness. So I think that it still is, because I was trying to say is like, well, if you had this sort of way of like some sort of, I don't know what to call it. I really don't. I don't know. Something like, let's just say sort of like a body solution or something. It would still require philosophy, because you have to allow yourself to get, like, open up your mind to the place where you say, wait a second, maybe that could have something to, I don't know. I'm not really sure. Maybe that's completely woo-woo, but maybe I should experiment with that. Maybe I should try that and see. And so it still requires philosophy. And I think that's it. But yes, I do think that I'm just thinking about the kind of the Venn diagram of the worlds that I love so much and that I feel have helped me so much is like the philosophy, and then thinking, like, if you want to call it like that holistic ecology, environment sort of world, and how these things overlap. I do think they overlap, because yeah, again, you're never going to really maybe question certain things if you don't have philosophy as a standard by which to question yourself, question what you feel certain about, you know. So anyway, thank you for listening, guys, and yeah, appreciate you all.
Well, what you're saying on the wellness, I'll give it to Michael. I think
Philosophy in that absolutely connects, because if philosophy has a lot to do in its methodology with observe, pattern, remember pattern, respond, then that's where health comes from. That it, like, okay, we don't wash our hands. What pattern? People get sick. I remember people getting sick when they didn't wash their hands. So let's do that. And I remember them not. Oh, let's have them wash their hands. And actually, one of the reasons we have this current war between this movement of wellness and the expert medical class is because we have an expert medical class saying health is all about quantification and methods. And the wellness people are like, no, actually, it comes from something that is more of this metaphysical, philosophical methodology that is being denied, that who knows what's that cutting us off from. And we're in the middle of that because we don't have Thomas Jockin's course on health. So everyone sign up for that. Those things are absolutely connected. As Mr. Jockin would say, health is the source code of metaphysics. It is the birth of analogical reasoning. Absolutely. And philosophy without analogical reasoning doesn't exist. So they're very much connected. I think also basically people, so you have pain in connection. Then you have the pain of the residual, as we're calling it. The pain of connection, I know that pain gives me a connection. But the pain of the residue, I don't know what the heck it gives me. So I don't know why to hold this pain. At least when I get pain in the map, in the blaming someone, in the connection, I know the pain is for something. But when it's in the residual, in the girdle point, I don't know what it's for. Well, because it's non-rational. It's conditioning. You see, this is why beauty, and this is where the virtue ethics should be. It's about a capacity. The point is a capacity that you have to hold it and to experience beauty and the geopet. It's about gaining a capacity, but if you don't have philosophy, you can't believe in that capacity. You're just a meaningless pain, it seems like. Why would you conclude that pain is pointing to the gaining of a capacity for something more? Well, you would need analogical reasoning, which is basically you could argue all philosophy is analogical reasoning. And so, this is an issue. I am also thinking about, you people are so fun to be here so late at night. I really appreciate it. But I'll give it to Michael here. What you judge is what you become. Absolutely. Most people are actually, also critically. One of the reasons why I think there could be a reluctance to see the problem of internally consistent systems in this situation, and even if that will get you out of the situation, that California, there you go, it's not so bad, is that if in this situation, it's possible that the problem is the problem of maps, then it could be in every situation like that. Oh crap, if you acknowledge it once, then it is a possibility all the time. And that would change everything. So then people are like, we're not going to acknowledge the problem of internally consistent systems at all, right? If you acknowledged that people are in their logics entrapped and it's nobody's fault and you get the residual, then that's always a possibility that you would have to consider every situation and going on. And that requires a lot of mental demand on you because it basically means you must develop philosophy or you're dead. And that demands a lot of you. So people are like, well, let's not do it at all, right? Because if you see the problem of internally consistent systems once, then you know it is always possible. Oh, crap. So it redefines the entire horizon of the world, which if you're not ready for, can destroy you. So that's one of the reasons why there can be a certain denial of it. The last thing I will say, a lot of this also gets into something I've been thinking a lot about recently, which is why in the world is the tree of knowledge called the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Why the and evil? Why not just evil? It's the good and evil. I'm really starting to think of that as good and evil. Because when we think of the problem of internally consistent systems, it's not the problem of evil, it's the problem of good and evil. As a whole, it's where some people are good and it's the dynamic interplay between good and evil that results in everyone being in indestructible maps. The problem of victimhood. Victimhood is where I'm good and something bad. Victimhood couldn't exist in a world of pure evil. It requires good and evil to have a dynamic. The problem of being gaslit, that requires a dynamic between good and evil. These personal situations that are being described, it would be easier if it was just evil, right? If it was just evil, you'd know what to do. The problem is that it's the dynamic between good and evil. It's the knowledge of good and evil that makes the world hell, where I'm good, they're evil, and that dynamic together. And basically, I've been thinking more and more of the problem of forgiveness, which ultimately is the ultimate non-rational address of all possible circumstances. I've been thinking more and more, and I mentioned this to Seth, I've been thinking more and more of forgiveness as returning the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's like giving it back, where you say, I don't know what good and evil is, so I'm just going to forgive them. Forgiveness is a radical, I don't know, right? I don't know. And it would seem to me, because you can always say you shouldn't forgive them. When is that enablement? When are you helping evil? And there's always this kind of back and forth. There's something about forgiveness that seems to be the only way to return the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that's what Jesus is doing. He's giving the knowledge back, right? If we do not do that, we're stuck in internally consistent systems, because all internally consistent systems are a product of good and evil, an interplay of good and evil, right? That are going back and forth. Obviously, before the knowledge of good and evil, you actually did have the knowledge of good and evil, but you had it in the presence of a relationship of love with God, not internal. The fall is into internal consistency. That is the fall. The fall is into the problem of maps that was hidden by givens, and then with the loss of givens, that is unleashed. And now that we managed the fall, which is the creation of the problem of maps of internally consistent systems, by creating givens, by creating cultures, we managed the problem. Well, we removed that, and now the problem has been unleashed. And the only way you can deal with it is forgiveness, because when Jesus shows up, that is also an unleashing of problems, because Jesus destroyed the givens of Judaism. So Jesus is, in the middle of history, a failure of givens that therefore unleashes the problem of internally consistent systems, because the Pharisees and the Sadducees are in an internally consistent system, necessarily interpreting Jesus as evil and Satan and wrong. They must, according to their internally consistent system, their logic, and the only way to address that is death on the cross. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. They know not what they do, almost as if they're in an internally consistent system. They're stuck in a map. They know not what they do. They can't see outside of it. The only way to do it is forgiveness. And in forgiveness, you die, right? It is very interesting, but that's the only way to give the fruit back. And it is very interesting, and looking at Bonhoeffer, to me, I think about Bonhoeffer as actually, in an odd way, in his way to kill Hitler, actually another example of returning the knowledge of good and evil, precisely because he could be seen as not Christian in doing this. Like, he is making a decision that is standing outside of, you would say, well, this isn't Christian to try to kill Hitler, right? And yet, and also when, like, Bonhoeffer tries to explain the activity, there's a certain kind of rawness to it. There's a certain kind of, like, it needs to be done. It is the thing that needs to be done. Is it evil? Is it good? Because Bonhoeffer is a Christian, he can be seen as betraying Christianity in doing this. This is what's very interesting. Only someone like Bonhoeffer, for me, is the proper response to the great evil of someone like Hitler. The problem is we have many people of whom actually, in a sense, this is what I would say, the World War II consensus is the using of Hitler to hold together what people would say is a neoliberal Washington consensus world order that doesn't put anyone in the place of having to be like Bonhoeffer, where they can be seen as a hypocrite, even, right? As being in the wrong. Like, what Bonhoeffer does is actually pay a price for his view of Hitler being evil. He makes an absolute choice. That's correct, right? He, in a sense, only someone like Bonhoeffer truly understands what the evil of someone like Hitler requires, right? Whereas the argument of the World War II consensus would be the evil of Hitler has actually been used almost like a utility to the benefit of holding together, well, the global capitalist order. And that is, that's breaking. But then the response, the address is actually found in someone like a Bonhoeffer. Because obviously the problem that you have with forgiveness is, okay, well, then do you forgive Hitler? That's obviously the question that people ask, right? If you're saying that you need to give back the knowledge of good and evil, does that mean that you need to stop someone like Hitler, right? I think this is a thought that is open. I think Bonhoeffer is actually an insight into this question. And I think what is actually stopping us from thinking the problem of forgiveness, which to me is the ultimate problem that has to be thought in order to realize the fullest potential of non-rationality to get us out of rational impasses that define everyday people's lives constantly. That problem is going to require thinking the Bonhoeffer, I'll say, principle. I think he's an insight into this. this would require more to expand on, but I am more and more seeing his particular life as actually part of this.
I'm wondering if so. I kind of want to understand more deeply what a judgment actually means, and what it actually means to judge. Because when you say what you judge is what you become, there's a type of judgment that I have in my mind where I understand what you're saying of like a judgment that is fueled by one's own kind of lack of a sense of integrity and like a solid self. Oh, you make an assessment and judgment. Okay. I feel like that's kind of where I'm going. Um, because, like just an example, like I was talking to a friend today and he was talking about how he's kind of having these discussions with his girlfriend about, um, like she is someone who like kind of wears her heart on her sleeve. And he believes that she sometimes does that to her own detriment in arenas where maybe she doesn't know someone that well, or um, it might be received in a certain way. And she then comes back and feels like he's judging her or he's shaming her, or she calls him like safe Sam, where like she thinks that he's kind of trying to be too calculated in how he, you know, reaches out to people, and she feels like that's people pleasery and it's not authentic. Um and so there's this, and she feels defensive, and then she kind of goes on the offensive. And I think that's an example of that kind of judgment, right? And that kind of, yeah, it is. I was like left kind of like, this is a really interesting conundrum of like, what does it mean to be authentic? And then what does it mean to be like kind of situationally authentic, right? Circumstantially authentic. Um, but then you have someone like Bonhoeffer who makes a determination that, because he talks about a lot in his book, that like faith is faith is demonstrated through action, and he's big on that. And so he's like really beating the drum of like, you can't, the image of the ascetic monk in the monastery is not like, is is not what Christianity means for him. It's like being out on the front lines fighting for what you believe in. Um, and so he makes a judgment, right? Or maybe he makes an assessment. I don't know. I'm curious to hear what you have to say. Maybe he makes an assessment that Hitler is is causing like unbelievable amounts of pain and harm in the world, and he ought to be stopped. And so, when you were talking about judgments, I was thinking about, like, now I'm kind of going all over the place, but I was thinking about like Ebert, and he made this in my mind really hilarious like Instagram post where he was advocating for being pretentious. He was like actually like being pretentious is like a good thing. Like we need, especially in the age of AI, like his argument was basically like we need to assert what we find valuable and meaningful so that we don't just become corrupt by these algorithms that, like, I had a dream last night that I listened to this artist and I was like, this is so good. And then I realized that it was AI music like afterwards. And I was like horrified. Like it was like a horrifying experience. And like, so that's making a judgment, right? About like what's good and like bad. And I see this all the time, how making judgments about aesthetics particularly, and like what we find beautiful and what we don't find beautiful, can really be very divisive. Like, um, and if you're trying to basically argue for like the why like reality TV, like people shouldn't watch reality TV. To someone who watches reality TV, it's like good luck, man. Like even if you feel like you are standing on like the moral high ground, it's like good luck telling someone who religiously watches the Kardashians they shouldn't. And and I feel like in that sense, when you're really trying to like, I don't know, defend this position, like, and it's like a hill you die on, but maybe it's like a lesser good than like God or something. I don't know. Maybe if it's like at the level of reality TV, it's like very easy to like get into kind of like bitter arguments with people and actually become what you judge. But I, so I'm curious what the distinction you make between assessment and judgment. And maybe if you believe what Bonhoeffer did was making a judgment or an assessment. And um, whether what he did is, or what a like person does in terms of making that judgment or assessment can become cancerous, or if it's, I mean, for him, it seemed like he was really convicted that like he was being compelled by God to like protect, preserve justice and act in the good of the spirit. And how do you, yeah, like I don't know, how do you have convictions without being corrupted by your judgments? Yeah.
Ooh, that's good. That's good. So that paper, Self-Delusion, the Tordiness of Evidence, and the Paradox of Judgment, maybe paper 4 and the map is indestructible. I've been thinking about that. That is kind of under that would be very relevant to this discussion. So also before I forget, basically to put it generally, if the World War II consensus is coming to an end, then we better be able to be like Bonhoeffer. If we're not, then we better not get rid of that World War II consensus. Oh, but if we don't talk about it, then people will and form these new nationalist little fascist groups that are popping up all over the world, questioning, reading books like Human Smoke or whatever. And we've got a problem on our hands. And then naturally, the problem of internal consistent systems leads to map proliferation, which leads to small fascist states. And then people say, what? And then a lot of people are like, what's wrong with that? Like, what's wrong if everyone separates into their small fascist states and leaves everyone alone? Well, this is what I would tell you, is that unless you're going to not be on technology, not have global trade routes, then these groups are going to interact. And one day, because they never interact with difference, they're going to blow up, and then that's going to cause a chain reaction. Because here's the issue. Natural resources are not evenly distributed. So all around the world has different things that other parts need, and that means if you separate, then unless you're going to be Amish, and not have technology, you must be interacting with difference that you've trained yourself out of the ability to handle because of the small fascist states that makes you feel comfortable with similarity, right? So that's why this blows up. And that's why the Amish are, honestly, basically, in my opinion, most responses to global capitalism, like Game B, for example, the logic of it is actually way more Amish than it realizes. Like, the logical end of that is Amish. If you learn about what the Amish actually are, which most people do not. But if you actually read, they're not anti-technology. They vote on and debate every technology that comes into the community. It's a very different matter. Basically, that's the only way. Unless you learn to deal with the problem of global pluralism. About that. So with Bonhoeffer, because this is really important, Bonhoeffer is actually a wonderful example. So judgment, to put it very simply, judgment, which again, I use the word judgment differently in different contexts, because sometimes when I'm using meta judgment, I mean it Aristotelian and Marx and sociology. But in this context, judgment as judgmental is where if I say you are a liar, assessment is when I say you lied. So when I say you are a liar, I am defining you by an activity, and I am basically putting it in your very essence. Judgmentalism you are a liar, you are X, Y, and Z is problematic and what you want to avoid. Even saying you are evil is very problematic because you are perhaps training yourself out of the ability to notice change or when a person can be redeemed, etc., so forth, right? Now, of course, there is evil, but identifying someone with evil to the point of bringing it into their essence is problematic, right? But that right there is going to get at the fine little line here that brings us to Bonhoeffer. If I say you did something evil, I assess it. I'm not defining you as evil, but I am also acknowledging reality, which in acknowledging that reality may call forth a response, right? Also, what you're saying about the individual, if you wear your sleeve, you wear your heart on your shoulder, and that makes you vulnerable, you're being judgmental. Basically, this problem of assessment and judgment cannot be solved without analogical reasoning, which is the methodology of health. Because basically, what did we say? If you grant me that phrase, metaphysical epistemology at the heart of health, you say, we notice when people are near swamps, they get sick. We remember this, and then we notice the people not near swamps don't get sick. Therefore, there's a pattern, and that would give us reason to believe being near swamps make you sick. Do we know this? Can we judge swamps? Can we say swamps are sickness? No, we can say there's reason to assess swamps make you sick, act on that knowledge, and then see what occurs, right? So you don't need judgment to get activity. You can have assessment that gives you response, right? That can be true. That can turn out to be accurate, right? So likewise, when you say, if you wear your heart on your sleeve, then there's a pattern that occurs. When you do that all the time, you end up in relationships with people that take advantage of you. And there would be reason to think, because in these other situations where you didn't, I've never met anyone that wears their heart on their sleeve literally constantly, like 24/7. Even the people that say they do that actually don't do it 24/7. They may do it 80-20, but there are times when they don't. And you can say, in the 20% where you don't end up in those situations. Therefore, there is reason to think that that would be the cause of it. That is analogical reasoning. You're saying like this, there's a logical form, because analogy is form-based. There's a form that I believe is an operation, which is a pattern that leads to certain outcomes. So what the individual is doing with the girl is not judgmental. It's the acknowledgement of a pattern. And patterns come from assessment, and this is a philosophical activity. But basically what's happening is because we're not philosophical, then all we can say is you're being judgmental. We can't tell, but this is why you need philosophy, because you can't tell the difference between different ways of arriving at conclusions. It's just all the same. People just, well, in my opinion, that's judgmental. Well, in my opinion, it's not judgmental. We're screwed. We're screwed. We have no systematic way by which to tell those differences, right? So you have to have philosophy, right? This actually goes very much to the Bonhoeffer question as I'm getting at that I'm thinking about it. Because what you do is if you're Bonhoeffer, you basically go, everywhere Hitler goes, there is a pattern of children dying, families being displaced, and great, great suffering. Therefore, there would be reason to believe that it is the presence of Hitler that is doing that. Therefore, there would be reason to think removing Hitler or killing Hitler would stop all of that, right? Yeah, and therefore you kill Hitler, right? Because you make a decision that the death of all those people or suffering of those people ought to be stopped, right? The reason, though, why this activity has a certain giving back of the knowledge of good and evil is because there's a certain, I'm choosing to do this. I don't know. Like, is it being judgmental? Is it not being judgmental? I'm not sure. I'm operating in a space of, is it right for me to decide that all of these people not suffering or dying is better than the life of Hitler? I myself don't know, but I've seen this pattern, and I have decided that stopping this pattern is the right thing to do, And I have very good reason to believe that it is Hitler that is doing it, right? So you can make a conclusion, and then God decides. Like, assessment can be the basis of activity to lead to someone like Bonhoeffer in a space of, the key is to see Bonhoeffer as returning the knowledge of good and evil. Like, this is my point. If you ask, was Bonhoeffer justified or not? That is a question of the knowledge of good and evil, right? And the point I'm making is that question can't, that's, you're failed from the beginning, right? Bonhoeffer is acting in a place of returning the knowledge of good and evil, a certain aporia, almost, in a kind of Socratic way, opening, like he's opening an ethical space in the same way that Socrates opens the philosophical space by getting you in a conversation you don't know what to think. It's precisely when you don't know what to think that then true thought comes forth. So what I see Bonhoeffer is doing is in ethics, he's creating an aporia similar to how Socrates is creating an aporia in thought. And to me, the reason why that's a big deal is because in a very real way, we haven't understood what ethics is. We don't know what ethics is. Like, we think it is the knowledge of good and evil. No, it is actually the heuristic of holding and carrying oneself with the residual. Above the map is in the realization. Ethics is the holding of oneself in the knowledge of the problem of internally consistent systems and the capacity to hold the residual and to make a decision in it that leaves you with pain. But to not, with that pain, give into the temptation of blaming someone, right? Like, there's a very interesting way in which one can imagine a kind of Bonhoeffer individual, because Bonhoeffer also obviously has a certain torment with many Christians, Karl Barth, all of them. Niebuhr are tortured by the question of the relationship of politics and Christianity, pacifism or not, etc. and so forth. There's a certain torture that's kind of going on, right? And in that kind of torture, it is not unimaginable that Bonhoeffer is holding a space of, I know the pattern that follows from the existence of Hitler, and I'm going to stop that pattern, and yet I am not going to take the step of judging Hitler. I will let God judge Hitler. Like, that is the move where, like, no. If you, surely, we need him to be judgmental and to hate Hitler and to see Hitler as the devil. The question is, did Bonhoeffer see Hitler as the devil, right? In the act of trying to kill him, was Hitler the devil? I think Bonhoeffer knew the devil was more evil than Hitler. And that actually provides the space of the possibility of giving back the knowledge of good and evil, and yet nevertheless acting. And that creates an aporia, a certain opening that actually brings forth a kind of terror as well, because it brings forth a certain terror of, wow, to be a Christian in the political is to make an absolute choice that I might not be able to justify, actually, precisely because I would need the knowledge of good and evil to justify it. What a terrifying space. What if everyone did that? Would the world just kind of fall apart? What would it mean if everyone gave back the knowledge of good and evil? What would it even mean to think that? It seems like the world would be effed if we did that. It would seem to. Bonhoeffer dies. He leaves us with that. So for me, Bonhoeffer absolutely opens an aporia where many questions have to be thought. I don't really think we're doing ethics seriously until we take the aporia that Bonhoeffer gives us. I think we basically wasted our thought on ethics. Let me put it this way. The question of ethics in relation to the political. I think Aristotelian virtue ethics is the ethics of the beautiful that is pointing us to that, which is the individual activity in the girdle point. But then, assuming the individual has a grasp on that, you still have the question, okay, but what do you do one day if Hitler shows up? Okay? Are you just going to not judge him? Are you going to do nothing? That the next step is the Bon, maybe we could call it here the Bonhoeffer clearing or the Bonhoeffer aporia. That is actually the pressing thought, like an incredibly pressing thought. But for me, we have to do the work of the girdle point in the ethics of the girdle point, if you will, to even be able to take that step of asking about the Bonhoeffer aporia. To me, that's the kind of order, and the challenge is of the utmost of the utmost concern. But none of it's even possible without analogical reasoning, without this sort of thinking of pattern response health. Otherwise, we just get stuck thinking we're judgmental or not judgmental, and that proves not very useful. There is more to be said, but I will stop and I will give it to Mr. Javier Rivera.
So what's interesting about this is that this is something I've always been unconvinced of, which is the problem of evil. Because the problem of evil seems to have its own force. Because for some reason, when people think, oh, problem of evil, that's like the perfect argument against God. Well, isn't it interesting that it's like still the perfect argument even when God doesn't exist anymore in society, right? It's like I've always said this, and people like always scoffed at me, and I said, if you eliminate God, fine, but you still have a problem of evil because you still believe in it, right? You can't just say that God is God's the one that allowed evil and so on, because for some reason we still believe that evil exists, and we still have a problem of evil. So then, well, what's interesting is somehow we end up in a worse position because now we have not even a metaphysical entity to blame for evil. Now we have nothing but to blame each other for. And so we still have a problem of evil. So in some sense, the atheist to me saying, oh, what about the problem of evil? Well, to me, I'm like always like, wasn't it everybody's problem? Like it seems to be everybody's problem in my opinion, because I have yet to really figure out this solution because it's such a perfect case example of who you're gonna blame when you start talking about the problem of evil. Who are you gonna blame? The other thing is I've noticed, and this is a very interesting distinction that I notice a lot of people don't make, is I've always said this. I've always said there's two types of suffering, two kinds of suffering. And then people get very confused because they're like, what do you mean two kinds of suffering? Well, it's the difference between what Daniel's talking about, between assessment and judgment. The first kind of suffering is the suffering that is the result of my malperception, of my inadequate perception of the world. If I don't have a correct perception of the world, I suffer. Then there is the suffering of the world that is sort of inevitable, right? I die, maybe I get cancer, maybe a gun go off by accident, a child dies. These are sufferings that no one really could control in a real way. But perception is our problem. Now, what happens is when you don't make this distinction between perceptual suffering and the suffering that is a part that actually exists. Now, here is my argument. The problem of evil is the problem of evil because one cannot make a distinction between these two types of suffering. Because, in my opinion, Christianity and Buddhism argue for the suffering that is, in the sense of the suffering that is for your own benefit. It is for your own maturity and growth. Now, the suffering that is our perceptual error is something that we must free ourselves from. Christianity talks about forgiveness. That's one element of it. That's an element of it, something that Buddhism talks about freeing your desire, eliminating attachment. Why? Because if you eliminate attachment, you understand that most of your understanding of suffering is actually your perceptual understanding of what you have contributed to your own suffering. Because actually, when you don't have a distinction between two types of suffering, all you see is, I'm suffering. Well, the problem I have with the I'm suffering element is, how do I know that it's me, that someone that's causing me suffering versus my perceptual problem that allowed me to create a suffering in which they did not create? How do I know that distinction? If I don't have that distinction, then all I have is a source of blame for suffering. And so everybody wants to eliminate suffering. But I think we all know that suffering really does have a developmental role to play. But I'll tell you the one that does not have a developmental role to play is the suffering that only allows us to entrap ourselves and enclose ourselves. That's the suffering that Buddhism wants to free you from. Everyone mocks, it's funny because everyone mocks Buddhism for, oh my God, they try to free you from suffering. That's impossible. And I'm like, yeah, that's impossible. But at the same time, they're not talking about the suffering that of death or of illness or of anything like that. They're talking about the suffering that you create from your own illusions and fantasies and lack of understanding and attachments. That's the suffering that we create. No one talks about the suffering that we create, because if we talk about the suffering that we create, then we have to face the fact that perhaps we have created our own hell, and that perhaps we are suffering for no good reason, and perhaps there is no one to blame. There is no God to blame. There is no Hitler to blame. But everyone thinks that detracts from the suffering that exists. And that's also a very dangerous thing. And that's something that I've always struggled to really make clear to people, is that just because you've had a perceptual error does not detract from the suffering that exists. But the suffering that exists is something that is not quite related to the suffering that you have made from the perception. But if you don't make this distinction, and I have seen this violence multiple times, if you do not make this distinction, you will only feel that the world is against you. You will only understand that the world is against you. And there is no problem to solve. There is no, and then the problem of evil is unsolvable, because then you realize that it has its own force. But really, once we get down to the bare bones of suffering as it really is, suffering honestly, once we suffer honestly, that's when I feel like we're actually in that girdle point that Daniel's talking about. Suffering honestly is the suffering that is. And there is nothing more to do with that other than to understand and be able to respond to this. But if we don't make this distinction, which is so crucial to our perceptual understanding, yeah, I mean, I just absolutely believe we're like screwed, because you can see it in the story of Job, when they try to blur this distinction of suffering. They literally try to push it on him. They say, well, didn't you do something? Didn't you do something? Actually, Job is probably the only one that's like, wait, hold on a second. I don't think it was my contribution at all. But I don't know what's going on. But I know I don't think it's me. So there's something about the suffering of what is that Job is suffering from. So he's really suffering and wrestling. And I think that's the real wrestling. The real wrestling is with the residue of, like, you cannot understand why this is happening the way it's happening. But everybody else is trying to make sense of it for you. And to me, that's when you fall into the perceptual suffering, which is, in fact, if we want to talk about necessary, unnecessary suffering, I will always say that suffering was unnecessary, but necessary for you to realize that there is a necessary suffering. It's because there is a necessary suffering that does exist that you understand there is a necessary suffering, but it does not mean that the suffering that you think is necessary was necessary. And yeah, I could go on about this.
Exactly. Absolutely exactly. And I'll give it to Michael here. Like, the necessity of unnecessary suffering
is to realize it was unnecessary. So in a similar way, you need the understanding that isn't reason in Hegel precisely to realize it's not reason. So you move like error. The fear of error is the fear of truth, right? But then the problem is never seeing the necessity of unnecessary suffering as the realization of it as not unnecessary, right? How do you make that move about philosophy? How do you do that sort of bend back on it without a certain way of thinking that is capable of so bending back?
One wants to overcome
the suffering of perception for the suffering of the residual. It takes a whole lot of work to actually establish an internally consistent system, precisely because you have to go through misperceptions and to find it as consistent. And there is such things as worldviews that what I call are mere notions, meaning they entail internal inconsistency. But my argument is now today, with the internet, with time, basically our problem is no longer determining the difference between internally inconsistent systems and internally consistent systems. Our problem today is the problem of internally consistent systems. In history, there have been thousands of notions. Now we might have 72 internally consistent systems. We move from thousands to 72, but 72 is way more than enough to F us on the worldview scale. And then, of course, in our personal lives, we still have hundreds. You know, there's no end to internally consistent systems, right? But basically, the Enlightenment, all of the kind of global efforts to make us more enlightened, have basically, all that has done, let me put it this way, the value of the rationalist project has been to move us from thousands of worldviews, if you will, to 72, because it was able to help us figure out which were internally inconsistent and got rid of them. But once you find the internally consistent ones, rationality can't do anything anymore. Rationality precisely is what makes them consistent and thus creates irrational impasses. So now we've reached the end of the role of rationality. What's critical here is this means rationality was necessary because there were very problematic internally inconsistent systems that getting rid of and deconstructing was very important. But because it works so well, we're tempted to overfit to keep using that tool in an age where all rationality does is create the problem and thus worsen it and thus repeat it in a bad way, right? So we have internally consistent systems, and of course people in their individual life, even if they're in their ideological worldview system, it's internally consistent. The very fact the problem has not been addressed is made evident by what happens in people's relational daily lives, right? The evidence that we haven't addressed this on the worldview big scale is evident by its occurrence in the small scale, if you will, right? And arguably in history, we have not connected what happens in the home with what happens in the war of the Samuel Huntington worldview war or whatever, right? We haven't thought they're connected. Well, actually, they're the same. They're isomorphic as the problem of internally consistent system, right? So acknowledging what happens in the home is actually an insight to what happens globally. They're isomorphic. They're the same. The suffering of perception is to get you to the place of moving from internally inconsistent to internally consistent. The suffering of the residual is the realization of the problem of internal consistency, which is in the girdle point. So the point of, and it is true that usually our misperceptions are due to attachments to being right, attachments to people that blur us with emotions, passion. So it is absolutely the case that it is usually attachment that makes us incorrect. And usually what it does is make us unwilling to face the person and to confront them, like you were saying at the beginning. That's one of the great ironies, is attachment actually keeps you from facing. Attachment sounds like it is facing. If you have a problem of attachment, it's actually the opposite. Attachment makes you unwilling to face. And so people tend to think it sounds terrible to get rid of attachment because they think attachment equals relationship. Actually, what you see is attachment is the opposite of relationship, because when you're attached in the wrong way, you don't meet the face of the person. So removing overcoming the suffering of attachment, which is the overcoming of unnecessary suffering, which is the suffering of internally inconsistent systems. That's an unnecessary suffering, is for realizing the necessary suffering of the residue in the Gödel point, which is what our moment now requires. And it is at the heart of the global pluralistic address that we keep talking about with belonging again and everything. The true is that the rational trilogy is basically the onto-epistemological framing of the social analysis problem of belonging again. They're isomorphic. The argument for us is that what belonging again is talking about is happening because it is the structure of thought itself, dang it. Like the structure of thought itself is what is giving us the problem of belonging again, because the problem of thought itself is a convergence on internally consistent systems that have to be faced for us to have an address. So there are two sides of the same coin, and that's why the truism of the rational is being written alongside belonging again together, because they're talking about the same thing. Because the problem of sociology that we have now is our social condition is being forced to acknowledge how thought works. And thought works toward rational impasses. Dang it. And you must bring in a non-rational. And how do we belong again, given the problem of rational impasse? Not easily, but we have to bear the suffering of the residual. I will also note just quickly, I love what you said of, you can get rid of God, but you still have the problem of evil. Yeah, so what we did is make evil God. We made, in the sense of the transcendent, that's the World War II consensus. Okay, we still have the problem of evil, but we don't have God, so we'll make the problem of evil address the death of God by actually making Hitler the transcendent ordering principle of the post-World War II world. That's the argument of that first Thames article, the return of strong gods. Basically, we still have the problem of evil, then that means we still have a transcendent to order the world. Great, great. Now, in a sense, with the failure of the World War II consensus, the problem of evil is really going to be a problem, because it's not even going to provide the transcendent ordering by which to address the problem. And we're not ready. I'll also say, I think it's really important too, and I'll give it to Michael here, and then if anyone has final things to say. For me, also understanding the problem of internally consistent systems helps, I think, understand how hell works. Because it doesn't seem to make sense if you say, how can a loving God create hell for people? That's eternal, right? Well, look at a problem of internally consistent system. According to its own logic, it never has to end. But at any moment, you actually could leave it. I think that's how hell is, actually. That it is a self-consistent logic that can go on forever, but at the very same time, it's not actually eternal in the sense like heaven is eternal. It is eternal in the sense of the internal consistency never has to stop, but it's not eternal in the sense of necessary being. Like, how do you describe an eternal, endless hell that doesn't give it the quality of necessary being? And I think many theologians have wrestled with this and actually had very problematic understandings of hell because they basically made it a necessary being when only God can be a necessary being, right? But the way I think you can do that, because basically anything eternal must be a necessary being, actually. That's a giant claim. Something can't be eternal unless it is a necessary being. Now, something can be timeless and not be a necessary being, but that's a very fine distinction. But timeless means it is self-feeding. It is able to keep going forever, right? Well, hell can be that, and the way hell can be that is by being an internally consistent system. That the very people in hell operate by a logic that keeps hell itself. And of course, the line that captures this so well from C.S. Lewis is, hell is locked from the inside. Basically, that little phrase, hell is locked from the inside, which some people have argued against, I've read it, but that little phrase, that's the majority of people's life on earth. They're in these internally consistent systems that are locked from the inside, stuck in their relational dynamics. Like, we see hell on earth very much, and if that is and in the same way that Aquinas said, well, reason should give us a sense of what heaven is like on earth because of the analogy of being, well, likewise, we should, from the analogy of being, get an idea of hell, actually. It should go the other way, too, right? So for me, internally consistent systems you see people in, if we use reason, analogously, seems to be whatever hell is like that. It has that structure, right? In the same way that you can reach conclusions about God and heaven via reason, via analogy, analogy of being. So I don't see why you wouldn't be able to do the same with hell. And for me, it does seem as if people's hell on earth is a product of internally consistent systems. It's either the suffering of misperception that's unnecessary, or it's the suffering of the residual. Hell has to be unnecessary and yet continual. That's the if it has to be unnecessary but continual. The only thing that does that is in the structure of internally consistent systems that people don't see. Because also critically, and this should be clarified, the only way to see the problem of internally inconsistent of consistent systems that you are in is via through the suffering of perception and getting through it and all of that, right? So the problem is still latent even if you can't perceive it. So the structure of hell is that problem even if you're still in misperception. There's a weird way in which if you perceive the suffering of perception, you're out of it. Because you see that it's, so there's the moment you get it, you're out of it. But that is the weird move with maps, where the moment you realize you're in a map, you go, oh, it's not the territory. If it's internally consistent, you go, oh, well then it can't be reality because reality is open. It doesn't close. So if this thing closes, it must just be a map. That's the weird move, is the moment you realize the problem of internally consistent systems, oh, it's not actually it's not so much a problem anymore, because that's the very move of seeing it, right? But that's the move where you go, wait, oh, correspondence does not equal coherence. It can't, because reality is open. You get that at the same moment. That's why it's a revelation. It has this bam moment because you see it all at once and it comes all together. And the transition is like that, right? But hell is where that never occurs. You're in an internally consistent system, but you never come through the suffering of perception to see it, so it goes on forever. But the suffering of perception is what? Unnecessary. So hell goes on forever, but it's unnecessary, which in a weird way means it doesn't have to go on forever, but that's actually why hell is hell. Hell doesn't have to go on forever. That's why it's so terrible, in a weird way. It doesn't have to go on forever and goes on forever. That's why it's so terrible. That's why it's so tragic. Like, you can see where God's like, this is absolutely horrible, right? And for me, also, that understanding is how you can have this idea of where heaven is a necessary being, and the glory of it is its necessity. The horror of hell is that it doesn't have to go on forever and does. That's part of the deep horror of it, right? And that's part of the horror of internally consistent systems that you see globally and in individual lives, right? So for me, again, it's a theological point that more would have to be said. But the problem of internally consistent systems, for me, provides a mean of an analogy of being to have understandings of the operation of hell in the same way that Aquinas and the like point to ways to get to knowledge of God via a different directionality. But let me pause and give it to Mr. Michael here. Michael.
A lot of things that I was thinking about as you were speaking so beautifully. The first thing is, well, actually, I think this was back to something Javier was talking about with, or maybe it was you, Daniel, I'm not sure, where you were talking about like when you're stuck in kind of an internally consistent system of blaming and believing, everyone else is at fault, and everyone else is to blame for your problems. That's how you interpret the world. And it's I'm a blameless victim, and everyone else, like the root of evil is, other people. And I was thinking how, there's that internally consistent system, which plagues many, many people and is, the cause of things like nihilism, despair, suicidality, but also on the other side of kind of the much more active response to that is, things like violence, and rage. But then there's also the flip side of that, which is I am at fault for everything, which turns it inwards. And you have, self-flagellation. You have, actually, I would say that is more conducive to things like suicide. In internal self-annihilation that has the belief of, okay, I am I am hell on earth and I am bringing that to my sphere. And so if I annihilate myself, at least I will be able to remove, this unique ill. Right. Um, and and yeah, it's just really interesting to me that, you know, like on either ends of those poles, it's almost like it's actually a sphere where it comes back to the same, yeah, it comes back to the same root belief of there being such a thing as absolute evil. It's either the world or it's me, and and fundamentally the the coherence between those two views is that that is a fixed stagnant thing, that either the ills of the world that are perpetrated by others will never change, and no one is capable of evolving, or what I think is absolutely evil actually is much more nuanced and gray than what I might be perceiving. Um, or, the same with oneself. And yeah, just, and I think what you said, Daniel, about hell being locked from the inside, um, is, and why that is so terrifying and why that is the absolute evil is philosophy as a way of life is not possible, because there is no possibility to think a new map, to think a new geography of being, to transform, to like change your life, um, is foreclosed to you. And it's interesting, reading a book like Man's Search for Meaning was kind of like the first philosophical book that I read, and who's it written by? Someone who survived the Nazi internment camps and put forth this, at the time, extremely moving argument to me of like, even in the concentration camp, it is possible to live virtuously, right? It is possible to have meaning as long as you are alive. I hear pastors say it all the time, like, as long as you are alive, God is not done with you. Um, and so I think the fact that that was still possible in that concentration camp, albeit undoubtedly near impossible to actually achieve, right? Um, is evidence that Hitler is not the devil, right? Because like if it was actual hell that Hitler created, that book could not be written. Um, like he could not have had the experience that he had to come out of it and literally create existential, you know, uh, psychology. Um, and so, and then, the last thing before I pass it back, this idea that, the World War II consensus, which I'm not um actually really familiar with, although I know a lot of people are talking about how it's eroding, and I definitely want to like plug into it, because I think I'm just like on a World War II kick right now, and I think it would be really interesting to learn about, is the idea of having Hitler as an organizing principle for the world post World War II, and fundamentally having an organizing principle that is what we don't want as opposed to what we do want. It fails every single time, because now we live, a lot of people talk about how we have this infinite choice, right? And the kind of the paralysis of choice about, all our givens are gone, so we have infinite choice on what religion uh we can be, because of global pluralism, and kind of the erosion, like kind of the erosion of a lot of like traditional ideas around like marriage. Like, now it's acceptable to marry outside of your faith, to marry outside of your ethnicity. Um, all of this choice, and then you have, the internet you're inundated with possible choice. You're seeing people live all these different types of lives, and there's this impression that there's this infinite choice. And I think when the organizing principle of the world is not what are we striving for as an ideal, but what are we trying to not be, then you're motivated by basically destroying everything that could factionalize a people, and everything that could I don't know if factionalize is a word, everything that could divide people, that could create another Hitler, right? That could create someone with that level of animosity towards someone else. But then on the other side of it, you just have this kind of wasteland of kind of like unlimited choice, but no choice really seems good. Or they're all equally good, and then you get a birdie and donkey problem. Um, and that's where we are. And and I think, a book like John Vervaeke's Zombies and the Meaning Crisis, where he talks about the like the majority of people, although the news would have you believe otherwise, but the majority of people who are stuck in a meaning crisis are not white nationalists who are angry, but are people who are numb, people who are listless, people who don't have direction. And that's the direct result of having an anti-type be your organizing ideal, as opposed to something positive. And there's people like Bishop Robert Barron who are calling for like young men to rediscover what adventure is, and talking about like people need to feel like they're moving towards something greater, and instead of like just being terrified of creating another Hitler, which kind of breeds paranoia and passivity and lack of risk taking. You talk about risk taking a lot, Daniel. It's like if you communicate to people like, and it's understandable, like to come out of World War II and be riddled with terror, but we didn't properly address that trauma. And yeah, now we're left to try and kind of pick up the crumbs, but alas, I'll pass it back.
Yep, it's the return of strong gods.
As Reno put it in his book, what we're seeing is the return of the strong gods. Basically, after World War II, we said, let's get rid of passion and ideologies and thoughts to make sure we don't get another Hitler, and it was a completely reasonable thing, but you can't do that forever. If you get rid of thymos, as Owen and the Agon has said, eventually the soul dies, and the soul doesn't take kindly to dying, and eventually the strong gods come back, which are these forces of passion in thymos, etc., so forth.
You cannot. The meaning crisis was basically inevitable when you organize the world
according to the problem of evil, ergo Hitler. Because Hitler is not enough for a good. Hitler will not help. Hitler may bring you to the birdie and donkey problem, but it will not be able to overcome the birdie and donkey problem. Like evil as in, I don't want Hitler. Hitler is evil. Therefore, I do not want piles 100 through 25. So you get rid of those, and now you have 25 piles. That's more than enough to starve that donkey. Hitler being evil helped me get rid of internally consistent systems 100 through 20, but now I have 1 through 20, and I have no idea how to help them interact, and they have no idea how to get along, and people are hurt, and we have another war situation. Oh, and drones are here. Great. Moving from 100 to 20 is better than being stuck at 100. But if you move from 100 maps to 20 and you have 20 internally consistent systems and you're stuck there, not enough. You've still got a problem, a major problem. So the World War II consensus, you could argue, has moved us, helped move us from 100 maps that pluralized and led to conflict and disagreement and religious wars or whatever, And it's brought us to 20, which you could say is real progress. And you could say, again, the history being a story of moving from, say, millions of maps down to 20 is incredible progress. But it's still not enough to avoid us blowing ourselves up and all being miserable, right? So basically, the meaning crisis appears when you're down to 20 internally consistent systems. Once you're down to the choices left over once you've removed all the bad choices. Like that's what the World War II consensus gives you. It helps you identify the bad choices. Great. Got them off the table, all good to go. Unfortunately, there's not only one good choice. If there was only one good choice now, we'd be fine because we know what to do. You get rid of all the bad choices, you have 20 good choices. Crap. That's more than enough to create the birdie and donkey. Okay, we need to get rid of all the bad ideologies that are clearly magical thinking. We need to get rid of all the ones that are clearly nonsense. Great. We did that, but now we have 20 internally consistent systems. Crap. How do we deal with that? Because that's deep difference. You can't force people out. Now we have an issue. And in having that issue, we have the return of the strong gods. Because if you say, basically we did this, we said, crap, we have 20 internally consistent systems. We can't get rid of them, so let's just numb people. If they're numb, these internally consistent systems won't fight. People will be numb. Let's distract them. Let's separate them. Let's give them money. Let's give them something, right? That worked for a time. And eventually it leads to the meaning crisis. So now we have the meaning crisis. And when you have the meaning crisis, then people, like Richard, Father Barron is saying, the only way you deal with that is to reclaim adventure, and to reclaim passion, and to reclaim themos. He's exactly right that we have to do that. But it is also absolutely true that that is what gives you white nationalism and brings back Hitler and destroys the world. What do we do? It really, really, really matters how people go about reclaiming adventure. It really, really, really matters how people gain virtue and do something passionate. Basically, the argument I would like to put forth is that the only way for people to return to passion, the strong gods, themos, is to move toward the residual, the girdle point. That is the only space that we can return the strong gods, return themos, return passion, return virtue, return belief, return religion, return ideology, return striving, and then not lead to war. It has to be in the residue. It has to be in the girdle point, which means the passion and the adventure comes in the adventure of finding if you have the capacity to hold that pain that Javier was talking about. That's a heck of an adventure, but that's a very different adventure from killing the dragon. That's the adventure of resisting the temptation to find a dragon. Is that even an adventure? Well, I think this is where literature has a role and art has a role because, for me, this is Mary Rose and Under the Wing. This is what we think about. Like, we think there is a lack of the literature of this kind of adventure, of the absolute choice. That this is the kind of story that has to be told with someone like Esperanza is all about internally consistent systems. Even Heroes is an internally consistent system. The Mother and Help, all of these stories about it are internally consistent systems. And what exactly is the kind of adventure and passion that people can fully give themselves over to in this context that makes possible the heroic, but not the return of true horror? Because I do think sometimes people don't actually understand the horrors that happened in World War II. Like, they really don't get it. If they did, and that's where I think it is very problematic to have all these people basically critiquing the World War II consensus and saying it doesn't hold us together and saying we need thymos, we need passion, we need the return of strong gods. Yes, you're absolutely correct. But I'd really like you to say that in the context of a deep study of what happened in East Germany, concentration camps, Japan, what it was like in Hiroshima. I want you to really feel that in your bones. And I don't think you can do that without literature, story, and biography. And we don't have a lot of people reading literature, story, and biography. So I question how many people feel that in their bones before they take on this incredibly dangerous topic. I don't think you can learn history without literature. That was Hayden White's notion. He said basically history must be in the form of literature or you don't feel it and therefore don't learn it. Because only history as literature creates empathy. And only empathy can get us out of the problem of internally consistent systems by giving us a residual. We live in very, very, very important times, I think. I think basically what is happening in the individual family relational situation, as Javier was describing, is actually also the very isomorphic description of what is occurring on the global theater, that it is all the same. It is basically the problem of internally consistent systems, which I represent with A is A. An internally consistent system is A is A. The moment you acknowledge A as A, you actually move to AB, though, because there had to be an acknowledger of it, thus a subject. And that opens up the possibility of the girdle point, because the existence of the subject in the internally consistent map is what connects it with the territory, and there's a break between the map and the territory. Therefore, A does not equal A equals B. A is in a relation with B, and therefore there's an opening afforded by the subject, but only if they have the capacity to hold themselves in that space and to hold open that opening. The choice is basically for us, are we going to live lives that are simply contributing to the manifestation and realization of internally consistent systems, or are we actually going to realize the problem of internally consistent systems versus use them in their very indestructibility to make ourselves indestructible? Because that's what people are doing. The reason why the main phrase, and then I'll close, I appreciate again y'all being here this evening as just some final thoughts. The main reason there's this stress on the map is indestructible, and by map that is just a smaller way of saying the problem of internally consistent systems as I use it with Korobowski. The problem is people, because maps are indestructible, they afford the temptation to use them to make yourself indestructible. And that's what everyone is doing. You see it in families. People are using their map to be indestructible. It is the temptation of, you will be like God. Who did they tell you? You would no, eat from this tree. You'll be like God. Yes, absolutely. The knowledge of good and evil with the hyphens make you like God, because it makes you indestructible. You do, in fact, get an internally consistent system that is all powerful and everywhere at once and indestructible. It defines every phenomenon. It gives you power in every situation. It gives you direction, and no one can destroy it. It absolutely makes you like God. But likeness is not the same as relationship. We're in an age where instead of giving into the temptation of using indestructible maps for our own egoic benefit, we see indestructible maps as a problem. That's resisting them. That's resisting the temptation to use them. We see them as a problem. And that precisely is then where you are like Jesus, honestly, because you're bearing the residue, you're bearing the cross, right? And in my opinion, Jesus is precisely occupying the realization of the problem of internally consistent systems. And he knows in that place, it requires, well, taking up the cross and being willing to go to death. And in that, being willing to forgive people. Because ultimately, the only way to assure, in all possible circumstances, in all possible worlds, that the non-rational, regardless, enters the frame to assure a rational impasse is not realized, is the willingness unto death. The willingness to stand in the girdle point even if it kills you. The willingness to forgive even if that risks people seeing you as enablement. The only way to assure that a rational impasse, ergo sin, does not have the final say is the willingness to give back the knowledge of the good and evil under all possible circumstances. Dying on a cross, forgiving them, even though they know not what they do. That's the failsafe. If you're willing to go to that point, then there is no circumstance that can arise in your life where a rational impasse necessarily has the last word. That doesn't mean you have to go to that point, because the circumstances of life may not put forth that of which would require it. They did for Jesus, and that's why, and you could argue if Jesus did it, then the necessity of someone doing it in the history of the world has been done, and therefore it is not necessitated for others.
Not to get too much more into my beloved Leibniz there. But if one is willing to be like Jesus, then there is no possible circumstance
where rational impasse must have the last word. If you're not willing to be like Jesus, then perhaps you get lucky and the rational impasse doesn't have the last word. Perhaps you have enough philosophical skill and know to navigate so that it doesn't.
But it is not the case that rational impasse necessarily won't have the last word unless you're willing to be like Jesus. That's at least how I think about it. The willingness to be like Jesus is the only way to assure that the rational impasse is never necessarily the final word. And that applies on the individual level in relationships just as much as it applies in the global theater between worldviews. And I do see Bonhoeffer on the political side as actually a manifestation of a non-rational activity that is not easily justified by Christian theology or ethics, and thus is perhaps a manifestation of the very non-rationality that ethics needs to avoid just being these quaint little thought experiments that it has become, that to actually bring ethics to bear on history, it requires someone to do that which is non-rational, and that's what we see in someone like Bonhoeffer. How, and the details of that must be elaborated on, but I do think he points to a secret in all of this. Ultimately, to close, unless Mr. Rivera, did you have anything, sir?
I just have a question. I'm sorry.
Please.
It came to my mind. Because I'm thinking, what would you say to this of the idea of consistent systems to me was a survival response to inconsistent systems, right? And to me, survival responses are never proper motivations. And this is a conversation that I had with someone where I said, well, what's your motivation? They're like, well, I want to be self-sustaining. And I was like, that's not a proper motivation at all. I was like, I don't know about you, but last time I checked, no one's really motivated by just the mere sentiment of surviving. At least it's not sustainable in any way. It's only sustainable until the point you're like, okay, so I'm surviving now. All right, what do I do now? It's like, it always comes down to that problem of like, well, what do I do now that I've made my system consistent because I've survived? Oh, wait. And to me, it comes down to this problem of motivation.
Yes.
So I'm curious about what you think about this position from surviving to thriving. Because I think what Michael pointed out was this trauma response of Hitler as a principle of like, okay, well, we shouldn't do that. To me, that's a survival response. That's not a thriving response. Why we're in the meaning crisis? Well, I don't know, because everyone's trying to think about how to survive, and they think the response is, oh, we need a more tolerant society. That's a surviving response. That's not a thriving response. You want a tolerant society because you don't want society to tear itself apart and destroy each other. Well, the problem is that when you fall to moral skepticism, surviving is not a good enough argument. Why not destroy each other? You need something more powerful than a surviving argument. You need a thriving argument. You literally need a vision. Because, yeah, I just realized I just played into Daniel's distinction. It seems like, yeah, thriving seems to be the vision versus survival is the planning. How are we going to survive? Well, last time, yeah. Anyways, yeah, I was just curious what you think. Is there something is it possible to have a thriving consistent system? Like, is that the next step versus, because I feel like at this point, all the consistent systems are mere survival. It's like it's funny because it's like a map. Use a map to survive with the territory. If you don't have the map, then you don't know where to go. You might fall into things that are toxic and so on. So you need the map to survive. So I do really imagine, that's good, Michael. I do really imagine, how do we come up with a thriving sentiment? And I know beauty is related, but I'm curious on your thoughts on this.
Yes, absolutely. It is very important to understand that the creation of consistent systems is not, quote unquote, inherently bad. People do it to survive, and it's especially necessary in a world of inconsistent systems, of chaos, and et cetera, so forth. There is a strong argument to be made that if consistent systems were not created, we wouldn't be here. You know, the world may have destroyed itself, right? Like, so consistent systems, and you could say our world, basically the ideologies that are still with us, communism, capitalism, whatever, this is the natural, historical natural selection down to the ideologies that are most able to hold the world together. But they still conflict, of course. That's the problem. It didn't come down to one. It came down to like 5. Well, that's not good enough, because now if the let's put it this way. If the response to inconsistent systems of consistent systems led to one consistent system, we don't have a problem. We're good. And actually, that is literally, I would argue, that was the Francis Fukuyama end of history argument. Is that we're done. We found the internally consistent system. It's neoliberal capitalism. Great. Well, no, Mr. Fukuyama, I'm sorry, but difference is deep, and there's like 6. And that's more than enough to get us all killed. So that's the problem. I associate the idea of the end of history with the idea of the arrival of a single internally consistent system, which means there wouldn't have been a problem. Because if there's one, there's no problem. It's where there are multiple. Now we have a problem. We have an incredible problem. We have a problem very different from previous problems, because deconstruction or finding which one is nonsense or whatever is not going to work. They're not. They're internally consistent, and they fight. Oh, frick, they fight. Oh, we're in trouble. But actually, then the other move is the argument that the realization of the problem of internally consistent systems is also a realization of an always already latent problem in history. That random novels like Anna Karenina, like novelists have basically been writing about this forever, and it's been there in people's personal lives. We've just not seen it globally until now. But it's always been there. You could say novels and much of art has just been evidence of the problem of internally consistent systems that was not in it, that had not gone through the historical process to be realized on the global scale. Well, now we've realized it on the global scale, and the problem in the household is actually the problem everywhere, and it's all internally consistent now. Like it's every scale of the problem of internally consistent. It's a fractal every level now. Like the whole world is a giant fractal of the problem of internally consistent systems. You look at every scale, it has the same shapes. Close, far, whatever, you're going to see the same shape. It's the problem. And the internet has helped get rid of inconsistent systems. The acceleration of knowledge, it's accelerated. So there's been a radical acceleration. Of course, there are still bad ideas out there, but they're much quicker to identify. They lose their stickiness and they go away. And people say, well, what are you talking about? Most of these conspiracies are bad ideas. The ones that are still around, for the people inside of them, are internally consistent. So they're part of the problem. The conspiracies are absolutely evidence of the problem of internally consistent systems. We want to believe they're irrational. No, they're deeply rational if you accept their premises.
So yeah, consistent systems, and also the map proliferation, the explosion of internally consistent systems are also actually what we're seeing today are efforts of people to survive the loss of givens. They're trying to survive. I don't have givens, so let me create a conspiracy where I'll think I'll understand the world. I have so much chaos that I'm going to frame my friends and family as wrong, so that I have a feeling of certainty when everything is fluid, so I know what to do. Like, actually, what's happening is I think families and marital issues are they're getting more susceptible to the problem of internally consistent systems, precisely because people are trying to survive the anxiety of a world without givens. Because if I'm right, I have direction. So it is absolutely a survival mechanism that has already been latent in thought itself, that is exploding now in response to the loss of givens, and we're still using rationality and being more intelligent to deal with this problem, when that is precisely what makes it worse. So if your problem is a rational impasse, more rationality makes more impasse. And when you get more impasse, you take that as evidence of needing more rationality, which gets you more impasse. Oh, what does that sound like? It sounds like hell. So basically, yes, we need a movement from surviving to thriving. This is my argument. Every map
entails a Gödel point. It must. After Kurt Gödel, we learned that there is no such thing as a formal system. That means all internally consistent systems are only consistent because
they're incomplete, which is the mind-bending, difficult move that Kurt Gödel is trying to get across. What he is saying is, if something is consistent,
it cannot be completed because reality is open. If reality is open, then the only way you get a perfect map is to never finish it. It's never closed. If you ever close it, then it can't be complete precisely when it seems complete. And that's the problem. The famous example that he gives,
but he does it in a much more elegant formula, is, as everyone knows, the liar's paradox, which is true or false. This statement is false. If you say it's false, when it's true, if you say it's true, then it's false, and you get this kind of you get this instability, right? So likewise, if you say the map is, the map is the territory, well, then it's not a map, it's the territory. But then if it's not of the territory, it's not a map. So you have this problem, right? So it's the issue is, the way I frame it is that Gödel shows you must always choose between coherence and correspondence. If you get coherence, you don't get correspondence. If you get correspondence, it's a meaningless fact. You don't have any coherence. You can't plug it up into anything. So you get correspondence that's meaningless, or you get coherence that you never know corresponds. Could be meaning, but it may not correspond, which means it could be Nazism, or it could be art. Hard to say. So how do we make sure that it's something more like art than Nazism? How do we make sure it's more on the side of thriving than on the side of... Because here's a really important point that it's midnight. You guys are great. Here's a really important point. One of the reasons people are going to small fascist states is because they feel at home finally. They literally feel belonging. One of the reasons why we've stressed belonging is because people are going to get it. They're going to find it. And we either think it anew and again, or people are going to go get it like they used to, which led to World War II. So thinking the idea that you could get rid of belonging, you cannot get rid of belonging. People go insane without belonging. So we either think it, or people are going to find it for themselves. And I will tell you how they will find it for themselves. They will find it in a small fascist state. And it will be everything they had always wanted. Things will be coherent. It will make sense. They will love it. And then they're going to need lithium from China, because their computers don't work without lithium, which means they're going to have to interact with another country. And all of those years of the wonderful feeling has made them weak to difference. And when they interact with China and they get angry, and then China says, you're not getting lithium, and they say, screw you, and now we have a war. So this is why we really need to think belonging, because people are going to go get it. Now, where do in our internally consistent systems, every map entails a Gödel point.
precisely the consistency of maps require it. The girdle point is found in the completion and seeing of the internal consistent system.
This is the weird move. The map is one giant girdle point. At the same time, there's a point in it that's the girdle point. Because there's one, somewhere in your map, you complete it. You bring it together, which then can be the moment where you see it. Right? So that's the weird move that happens at the same time. That then, in finding that girdle point, which is the completion of the internal consistency, you thus can, in that very moment, the supreme accomplishment of a consistent system is precisely when you see it as a problem. That is the negation of the negation. It's very, because basically the girdle point is absolute knowing. It is absolutely absolute knowing. And we have moved through survival. We are now in the age where we must negate into absolute knowing, or we're screwed, because absolute knowing is a certain encountering of limit. Well, the encountering of limit here is the realization that an internally consistent system doesn't correspond. That's the limit. Therefore, we have a problem. It turns into a problem, which is the encounter of the limit, which means you have to somehow see this problem as the thriving. The problem must be the cause of the thriving. So we have inconsistent maps. We've basically worked through those at this point of history via survival. Okay? But now we are at the problem of internally consistent systems, which for me, can actually locate in religion for Hegel's phenomenology. So spirit, so we're now in religion. Jordan Peterson represents this, etc., so forth. And a lot of people calling are basically saying, we need internally consistent. If you follow the logic of many of the people in the kind of conversation with Peterson, they're basically saying,
do some internally consistent system
well. That's what they're saying. They're saying, do it well, and if you do it well, you'll thrive. In an absolute sense, that's true, because you can't get to the girdle point unless you complete an internally consistent system. But the completion of it is not the thriving. It's the hitting of the problem where the thriving can now happen. But you have to get to that point. So in a sense, it's part of the thriving, but only as a necessary prerequisite to get to the possibility of the thriving, which is the realization of the girdle point, which is the realization of the residue.
Crap. Thriving is, so basically the possibility of
Thriving is in internally consistent systems that recognize the girdle point. That is where thriving is possible. All right. How do we recognize the girdle point? Because here's a really hilarious problem. Everything I just said could become part of your internally consistent system. You can just say, yeah, I have a girdle point. Great. Crap. The very knowledge of the girdle point could just be folded into a consistent system. How do you actually live it? How do you actually live the girdle point, dang it? How do you actually feel it and day in and day out do it? Well, facing the other person. So at the beginning of the conversation, you brought up the idea of, can you really blame someone unless you face them? Like, you go and see them, and like, what are we doing if we don't do that? Yeah, that is absolutely the work of the girdle point. That is the place of thriving. That is the work. And that is the place where you feel the residue, where you feel the limits of absolute knowing, where you feel the inadequacy of the knowledge of good and evil, where you feel a violence upon you that you're bearing that was thrown on you like was thrown on Jesus. That's where you freaking live it. And it is done in facing the other. And the maps do everything in their power to make sure you don't go there. They give you in the internal consistency, talk to everyone else first. Get their opinion. That is all work of consistency, avoiding the girdle point, when what you should do is face them. Basically, at the end of the day, everything that I've said about girdle points, which is all incredibly, you could say, okay, that's nice and all, but how many people are going to freaking learn it or whatever, and learn all of that? The only way you can ever, in my opinion, basically
change the world, if you give me that, or address a global address, it must come down to basically a single principle. The reason why it has to come down to a single principle is because the highest probability of an address in all possible worlds, and by all possible worlds, Leibniz does not mean multiple dimensions. He means in any possible future, in any possible condition and situation that may arise. The highest probability of a address that would apply in all possible worlds must be a single principle. If it is 2 or 3 or 4, it's compound and less likely to make it because it requires more energy and more coordination to maintain many parts, right? So you need it to be 1. And that one principle must contain the complexity of everything I said, even if nobody knows it does. Just the doing of it is the living out everything we have described, even if you don't know any of the stuff I just said. Because anything short of that would require everyone to learn philosophy, which would take the average person and basically oppress them and force them into your bubble, versus be philosophy. Average people can be philosophical without reading a text of philosophical, right? So to spread philosophical consciousness does not require everyone to read philosophy. It requires everyone to do that single principle that doing is the unfolding of the philosophy. That is very possible because it's a single principle of which entails in it everything that we've said without people actually having to study it, right? What is this principle? When you have a problem with your brother, go to them. Face them. And we always have good reasons not to. We always have reasons why that would be wrong, or they should do this first, or it would be meaningless because they don't listen to people. And there's always really freaking good reason not to do the work. Of the courage, of the encounter, that will be surprising, that will be in a space beyond the knowledge of good and evil, that in you stepping into, you've chosen to give it back because you can't justify it and you don't know it is a non-rational activity. There will always be reason not to do it. The more pieces you add, the less likely it's going to work. The only way to avoid a three-body problem is to stay to one. And one principle that brings in two people. Principle is the relation. We have the two here. We have that. It cannot be planned what is going to occur because it is 3, but you can be prepared for it. But just because you can't plan it, since it is based on a single principle, this unplannable space will not lead into chaos. When you bring in many people, you create an unplannable space that creates chaos, and that's where everyone gets hurt and you get all of the madness. The girdle point cannot be planned, but it can be sustained in people that are prepared for it, that have a vision of why. And perhaps that vision is a world that has managed the global address to move beyond rational impasses, of people that have actually gained the capacity to hold the residue with one another because they have come to make the absolute choice that doing so will afford possibilities of beauty and geopedia that under no other condition are so possible. I think that is an effort worth believing in. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time this evening. I've enjoyed it.